house by the sea. Those were the days, how fast they would change. Now I'm standing here wishing back to that way. What we've got, it's hard to find. Without you, girl, I'm paralyzed. I want you back here, you and I won't give up, I can't deny that you'll come back, I'm giving you time. Trying so hard to not say goodbye. You've gone and you've left your shadows behind. Girl, you are something else. Why can't we work this out? 'Cause you make me feel love is for real when I've got you by my side. And I can't forget the day that we met. I want you to realize what we've got, it's hard to find. Without you, girl, I'm paralyzed. I want you back here, you and I won't give up, I can't deny that you'll come back, I'm giving you time. Trying so hard to not say goodbye. You've gone and you've left your shadows behind. Take me back to the days, holding hands and laughing the nights away. Will things ever be the same? I was your man and I want it back that way. Chasing our dreams for what it would seem. A family, 2 kids in a house by the sea. Those were the days, how fast they would change. Now I'm standing here wishing back to that way.
Hello there. Welcome to the shit show. I think I actually managed to get everything loaded correctly. And I even unmuted my microphone the first time. So yay me. Let me know if you need me to turn the music down. Actually, I'm gonna pause it so it will start up with instrumentals. No, bad you. You are hear me now? Oh, that's good. Oh, good Lord. How dare you mute me? How dare. Why will you not? Stop playing instrumentals. I will not be silenced. That is right. Hi, baby. Love you. Okay, it's switched to instrumentals. We're safe. We're safe, though once we start with the story, we'll be turning that off anyways. So how is everyone tonight? I know I've talked to most of you already today. I know you're sleepy, baby. I'm sorry. I'm glad you're doing better than you were yesterday. And hopefully you will be doing better tomorrow than you are today. Okay, let's try drinking water. Also, I figured out why I kept sliding out of my seat. And it's because the back is broken, and so the back is all the way down, so I can't get my fat ass all the way back in the seat. But if I take the seat completely off, then I'm afraid that I'll like fall over backwards. So first stream goal, get a chair. No, this chair is fine. Now that I know what the problem is, I can lift the seat up and slide my ass back. Thrilling stream content. That's why I said this is a shit show. But it's my shit show. My poor baby is cold and I am hot because the weather is all screwed up. But global warming isn't real, remember. Please send me the cold. I mean, it's not that it's not cold outside, it's just my house holds in heat forever. Because it was only, I don't know what the temperature was today. But even overnight it gets down into like the 40s. My house never gets below 69. And because I use the stove, all the heat is kind of built up in the house. So now it's like 74 in the house. But I refuse to turn the air conditioner on. I just open windows and hope for the best. That's pretty much how I live my life. Just hope for the best. Well, let us switch over to our campfire. Because that's what we're all really here for. We're here for the campfire. I need to reset my bit cut. Because that's going to bug me. Cold has an expiration date? No. Welcome to another game of what in the hell is Vicky doing? what I'm doing. Oh, here we go. There. Now I'm happy. Not really. Hipster Mom, that's an appropriate song title. Let us go to our... Hey, how are you doing? Welcome to the stream. We're just getting ready to start reading. So I will switch to Arc Fire, and I will mute the weird-ass music. Because we don't want to listen to music, we just want our campfire. We are going to finish this story. I mean, the good news is we're on the 4th part. The 4th part is as long as the other half of the story that I read yesterday, so we may be here a while. That's okay. I will finish this thing. I will. Alright, so the case of Charles Dexter Ward. Longest short story ever. Be sure to drink your water. Don't want anybody dehydrating. Oh no, the VOD is up. The VOD will be up for 60 days. And it'll also be... Because, yeah, after midnight tonight, I can make it public on YouTube. So, you can catch the first half of the story on the VOD. I mean, I think the exciting stuff, because the story's been, I'm not going to say it's a bad story, but I don't think, I skimmed through this, and I don't think you need to have listened to the first half. Yes, hold your hands up to the stream and get warm. The action happens in this half, so this is the only half that you need. Someday I will make a bot command to link to the YouTube channel. But that day is not today. Today we are just going to finish this story. Part 1 of Chapter 4. Hold your hands up as I scream. Let me know if it warms you. That would be spoopy. Hold your hands up to the scream. When you held it up to the scream, did it scream back? That would be an interesting haunted house, though. Screams for warmth. I don't know why my voice sounds scratchy tonight. I better not be getting sick. In the week following that memorable Good Friday, Charles Ward... Oh, wait. Back up. I forgot. I'm not a good reader. Chapter 4 is called A Mutation and a Madness. I have to give you the chapter titles to properly read. In the week following that memorable Good Friday, Charles Ward was seen more often than usual, and was continually carrying books between his library and the attic laboratory. His actions were quiet and rational, but he had a furtive, hunted look which his mother did not like, and developed an incredibly ravenous appetite as gauged by his demands upon the cook. Dr. Willett had been told of those Friday noises and happenings, and on the following Tuesday had a long conversation with the youth in the library where the picture stared no more. The interview was, as always, inconclusive, but Willett is still ready to swear that the youth was sane and himself at the time. He held out promises of an early revelation, and spoke of the need of securing a laboratory elsewhere. At the loss of the portrait he grieved singularly little, considering his first enthusiasm over it, but seemed to find something of positive humor in its sudden crumbling. About the second week, Charles began to be absent from the house for long periods, and one day, when good old Black Hannah came to help with the spring cleaning, she mentioned his frequent visits to the old house in Olney Court, where he would come with a large valise and perform curious delvings in the cellar. He was always very liberal to her and to old Asa, but seemed more worried than he used to be, which grieved her very much, since she had watched him grow up from birth. Another report of his doings came from Pawtuxet, where some friends of the family saw him at a distance a surprising number of times. He seemed to haunt the resort and canoe house of Rhodes on the Pawtuxet, and subsequent inquiries by Dr. Willett at that place brought out the fact that his purpose was always to secure access to the rather hedged-in riverbank, along which he would walk towards the north, usually not reappearing for a very long time. Late in May came a momentary revival of ritualistic sounds in the attic laboratory, which brought a stern reproof from Mr. Ward, and a somewhat distracted promise of amendment from Charles. It occurred one morning, and seemed to form a resumption of the imaginary conversation noted on that turbulent Good Friday. The youth was arguing or remonstrating wholly with himself, for there suddenly burst forth a perfectly distinguishable series of clashing sounds in differentiated tones, like alternate demands and denials, which caused Mrs. Ward to run upstairs and listen at the door. She could hear no more than a fragment whose only plain words were, "Must have it read for 3 months," and upon her knocking all sounds ceased at once. When Charles later was questioned by his father, he said that there were certain conflicts of spheres of consciousness which only great skill could avoid, but which he would try to transfer to other realms. About the middle of June, a queer nocturnal incident occurred. In the early evening there had been some noise and thumping in the laboratory upstairs, and Mr. Ward was on the point of investigating when it suddenly quieted down. That midnight, after the family had retired, the butler was night-locking the front door when, according to his statement, Charles appeared somewhat blunderingly and uncertainly at the foot of the stairs with a large suitcase, and made signs that he wished egress. The youth spoke no word, but the worthy Yorkshireman caught one sight of his fevered eyes and trembled causelessly. He opened the door, and young Ward went out, but in the morning he presented his resignation to Mrs. Ward. There was, he said, something unholy in the glance Charles had fixed on him. It was no way for a young gentleman to look at an honest person, and he could not possibly stay another night. Mrs. Ward allowed the man to depart, but she did not value his statement highly. To fancy Charles in a savage state that night was quite ridiculous, for as long as she had remained awake she had heard faint noises from the laboratory above, sounds as if of sobbing and pacing, and of a sighing which told only of despair's profoundest depths. Mrs. Ward had grown used to listening for sounds in the night, for the mystery of her son was fast driving all else from her mind. The next evening, much as on another evening nearly 3 months before, Charles Ward seized the newspaper very early and accidentally lost the main section. The matter was not recalled till later, when Dr. Willett began checking up loose ends and searching out missing links here and there. In the journal office, he found the section which Charles had lost and marked 2 items as of possible significance. They were as follows: more cemetery delving. It was this morning discovered by Robert Hart, night watchman at the North Burial Ground, that ghouls were again at work in the ancient portion of the cemetery. The grave of Ezra Whedon, who was born in 1740 and died in 1824, according to his uprooted and savagely splintered slate headstone, was found excavated and rifled, the work being evidently done with a spade stolen from an adjacent tool shed. Whatever the contents may have been after more than a century of burial, all was gone except a few slivers of decayed wood. There were no wheel tracks, but the police have measured a single set of footprints which they found in the vicinity, and which indicate the boots of a man of refinement. Hart is inclined to link this incident with the digging discovered last March, when a party in a motor truck were frightened away after making a deep excavation, but Sergeant Riley of the 2nd Station discounts this theory and points to vital differences in the 2 cases. In March, the digging had been in a spot where no grave was known, but this time a well-marked and cared-for grave had been rifled with every evidence of deliberate purpose, and with a conscious malignity expressed in the splintering of the slab which had been intact up to the day before. Members of the Whedon family, notified of the happening, expressed their astonishment and regret, and were wholly unable to think of any enemy who would care to violate the grave of their ancestor. Hazard Whedon of 598 Angel Street recalls a family legend according to which Ezra Whedon was involved in some very peculiar circumstances, not dishonorable to himself, shortly before the Revolution, but of any modern feud or mystery he is frankly ignorant. Inspector Cunningham has been assigned to the case and hopes to discover some valuable clues in the near future. Dogs noisy in Pawtuxet. Residents of Pawtuxet were aroused around 3 a.m. today by a phenomenal baying of dogs, which seemed to center near the river just north of Rhodes on the Pawtuxet. The volume and quality of the howling were unusually odd, according to most of who heard it, and Fred Lemden, night watchman at Rhodes, declared it was mixed with something very like the shrieks of a man in mortal terror and agony. A sharp and very brief thunderstorm, which seemed to strike somewhere near the bank of the river, put an end to the disturbance. Strange and unpleasant odors, probably from the oil tanks along the bay, are popularly linked with this incident, and may have had their share in exciting the dogs. The aspect of Charles now became very haggard and hunted, and all agreed in retrospect that he may have wished at this period to make some statement or confession from which sheer terror withheld him. The morbid listening of his mother in the night brought out the fact that he made frequent sallies abroad under cover of darkness, and most of the more academic alienists unite at present in charging him with the revolting cases of vampirism which the press so sensationally reported about this time, but which have not yet been definitely traced to any known perpetrator. These cases, too recent and celebrated to need detailed mention, involved victims of every age and type, and seemed to cluster around 2 distinct localities: the residential hill and the north end near the Ward home, and the suburban districts across the Cranston line near Pawtuxet. Both late wayfarers and sleepers with open windows were attacked, and those who lived to tell the tale spoke unanimously of a lean, lithe, leaping monster with burning eyes, which fastened its teeth in the throat or upper arm and feasted ravenously. Dr. Willett, who refuses to date the madness of Charles Ward as far back as even this, is cautious in attempting to explain these horrors. He has, he declares, certain theories of his own, and limits his positive statements to a peculiar kind of negation. I will not, he says, state who or what I believe perpetrated these attacks and murders, but I will declare that Charles Ward was innocent of them. I have reason to be sure he was ignorant of the taste of blood, as indeed his continued anemic decline and increasing pallor prove better than any verbal argument. Ward meddled with terrible things, but he has paid for it, and he was never a monster or a villain. As for now, I don't like to think. A change came, and I'm content to believe that the old Charles Ward died with it. His soul did, anyhow, for that mad flesh that vanished from Waite's hospital had another. Willett speaks with authority, for he was often at the Ward home attending Mrs. Ward, whose nerves had begun to snap under the strain. Her nocturnal listening had bred some morbid hallucinations, which she confided to the doctor with hesitancy, and which he ridiculed in talking to her, although they made him ponder deeply when alone. These delusions always concerned the faint sounds which she fancied she heard in the attic laboratory and bedroom, and emphasized the occurrence of muffled sighs and sobbing at the most impossible times. Early in July, Willett ordered Mrs. Ward to Atlantic City for an indefinite recuperative sojourn, and cautioned both Mr. Ward and the haggard and elusive Charles to write her only cheering letters. It is probably to this enforced and reluctant escape that she owes her life and continued sanity. Hey! Hello, Jose. Hello, Jose. I know that's not how you pronounce it. But you will always be my Jose. It's good to see you. It has been a while. It has been a long while. I'm sorry that insomnia is what brings you here. Now I feel bad because I can't remember how to pronounce your name. Is it Yost? 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 I would call you Jay. Insomnia brings most people to my stream, and that's kind of sad. I mean, I'm glad that you listened to me. Oh, good, I got it right. I did remember. Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad I remembered, and I'm glad to see you here again. It has indeed been a while. Part 2. Not long after his mother's departure, Charles Ward began negotiating for the Pawtuxet bungalow. It was a squalid little wooden edifice with a concrete garage, perched high on the sparsely settled bank of the river, slightly above Rhodes, but for some odd reason the youth would have nothing else. He gave the real estate agencies no peace till one of them secured it for him at an exorbitant price from a somewhat reluctant owner, and as soon as it was vacant he took possession under cover of darkness, transporting in a great closed van the entire contents of his attic laboratory, including the books both weird and modern which he had borrowed from his study. He had this van loaded in the black small hours, and his father recalls only a drowsy realization of stifled oaths and stamping feet on the night the goods were taken away. After that, Charles moved back to his own old quarters on the 3rd floor and never haunted the attic again. Oh no, I know that I stream at a time that doesn't, time zones. We need a movement to eliminate time zones. We need to all use universal time. We should all be on Greenwich Mean Time. I don't expect anyone to be out of bed at 5:30 in the morning listening to me. So, you are fine. Aww. You are very sweet. You can always catch the VODs on Twitch, and they're uploaded to YouTube the day after. So you can always hear them. And they should stay on Twitch for 60 days, and they'll be on YouTube forever and ever and ever. To the Pawtuxet bungalow, Charles transferred all the secrecy with which he had surrounded his attic realm, save that he now appeared to have two sharers of his mysteries: a villainous-looking Portuguese half-caste from the South Main Street waterfront who acted as a servant, and a thin, scholarly stranger with dark glasses and a stubby full beard of dyed aspect, whose status was evidently that of a colleague. Neighbors vainly tried to engage these odd persons in conversation. The mulatto Gomez spoke very little English, and the bearded man, who gave his name as Dr. Allen, voluntarily followed his example. Ward himself tried to be affable, but succeeded only in provoking curiosity with his rambling accounts of chemical research. Before long, queer tales began to circulate regarding the all-night burning of lights, and somewhat later, after this burning had suddenly ceased, there rose still queerer tales of disproportionate orders of meat from the butchers, and of the muffled shouting, declamation, rhythmic chanting, and screaming supposed to come from some very deep cellar below the place. Most distinctly, the new and strange household was bitterly disliked by the honest bourgeois of the vicinity, and it is not remarkable that dark hints were advanced connecting the hated establishment with the current epidemic of vampiristic attacks and murders, especially since the radius of that plague seemed now confined wholly to Pawtuxet and the adjacent streets of Edgewood. No, it's not as fun as being live. That is true. That is very true. One day I will stream full-time, and then I will just stream like every day, all day, and everyone can hear me, and won't that be a beautiful world? I mean, I could stream. Well, I could stream later. Something to think about. Ward spent most of his time at the bungalow, but slept occasionally at home and was still reckoned a dweller beneath his father's roof. Twice he was absent from the city on week-long trips, whose destinations have not yet been discovered. He grew steadily paler and more emaciated even than before, and lacked some of his former assurance when repeating to Dr. Willett his old story of vital research and future revelations. Willett often waylaid him at his father's house, for the elder Ward was deeply worried and perplexed, and wished his son to get as much sound oversight as could be managed in the case of so secretive and independent an adult. The doctor still insists that the youth was sane even as late as this, and it adduces many a conversation to prove his point. About September the vampirism declined, but in the following January, Ward almost became involved in serious trouble. For some time, the nocturnal arrival and departure of motor trucks at the Pawtuxet bungalow had been commented upon, and at this juncture an unforeseen hitch exposed the nature of at least one item of their contents. In a lonely spot near Hope Valley, there occurred one of the frequent sordid waylayings of trucks by hijackers in quest of liquor shipments, but this time the robbers had been destined to receive the greater shock. For the long cases they seized proved upon opening to contain some exceedingly gruesome things, so gruesome in fact that the matter could not be kept quiet among the denizens of the underworld. The thieves had hastily buried what they discovered, but when the state police got wind of the matter, a careful search was made. A recently arrested vagrant, under promise of immunity from prosecution on any additional charge, at last consented to guide a party of troopers to the spot, and there was found in that hasty cache a very hideous and shameful thing. It would not be well for the national, or even the international, sense of decorum if the public were ever to know what was uncovered by that awestruck party. There was no mistaking it, even as these far from studious officers and telegrams to Washington ensued with feverish rapidity. Yeah, I would love to be able to live off of streaming. Because I like streaming. I like talking to people. I like reading. Gaming will never be my full-time thing. But I like reading. I would love to one day be able to have a webcam, show some crafting, teach some art, teach some geology, get out in the field more. But for now, that is not to be. One day. My secret plan is affiliates can now run ads. If I run a 60-second ad, I make a penny, make a shiny penny for every viewer that watches it. So I just have to get the word out there on a set day and time. I need everybody to watch one ad. And that's it. They just need to watch that ad and I will make my money. And I think that would be hilarious and probably get me banned from Twitch. But hey, girls got a dream. That is my dream. The cases were addressed to Charles Ward at his Pawtuxet bungalow, and state and federal officials at once paid him a very forceful and serious call. They found him pallid and worried with his two odd companions, and received from him what seemed to be a valid explanation and evidence of innocence. He had needed certain anatomical specimens as part of the program of research whose depth and genuineness anyone who had known him in the last decade could prove, and had ordered the required kind and number from agencies which he thought as reasonably legitimate as such things can be. Of the identity of the specimens, he had known absolutely nothing, and was properly shocked when the inspectors hinted at the monstrous effect on public sentiment and national dignity which a knowledge of the matter could produce. In this statement he was firmly sustained by his bearded colleague, Dr. Allen, whose oddly hollow voice carried even more conviction than his own nervous tones, so that in the end the officials took no action, but carefully set down the New York name and address which Ward gave them as a basis for a search which came to nothing. It is only fair to add that the specimens were quickly and quietly restored to their proper places, and that the general public will never know of their blasphemous disturbance. On February 9, 1928, Dr. Willett received a letter from Charles Ward which he considers of extraordinary importance, and about which he has frequently quarreled with Dr. Lyman. Lyman believes that this note contains positive proof of a well-developed case of dementia praecox, but Willett, on the other hand, regards it as the last perfectly sane utterance of the hapless youth. He calls especial attention to the normal character of the penmanship, which, though showing traces of shattered nerves, is nevertheless distinctly Ward's own. The text in full is as follows. Drink time, everyone. Am I making decisions working towards that goal? There's not really a lot of decisions that I can make about it right now. There are things going on that kind of have me stuck where I am. And eventually that will change. And I will move on. But for now, things are what they are. And I have accepted it. One day it will change. Not today. But one day. You will never catch me. You will never catch me. Or my tools. I will beat you all with my geology hammer. "100 Prospect Street, Providence, Rhode Island, February 8th, 1928. Dear Dr. Willett, I feel that at last the time has come for me to make the disclosures which I have so long promised you, and for which you have pressed me so often. The patience you have shown in waiting, and the confidence you have shown in my mind and integrity are things I shall never cease to appreciate. And now that I am ready to speak, I must own with humiliation that no triumph such as I dreamed of can ever be mine. Instead of triumph, I have found terror, and my talk with you will not be a boast of victory, but a plea for help and advice in saving both myself and the world from a horror beyond all human conception or calculation. You recall what those Fenner letters said of the old raiding party at Pawtuxet. That must all be done again, and quickly. Upon us depends more than can be put into words. All civilization, all natural law, perhaps even the fate of the solar system and the universe. I have brought to light a monstrous abnormality, but I did it for the sake of knowledge. Now for the sake of all life and nature, you must help me thrust it back into the dark again. I have left that Pawtuxet place forever, and we must extirpate everything existing there, alive or dead. I shall not go there again, and you must not believe it if you ever hear that I am there. I will tell you why I say this when I see you. I have come home for good, and I wish you would call on me at the very first moment that you can spare 5 or 6 hours continuously to hear what I have to say. It will take that long, and believe me when I tell you that you never had a more genuine professional duty than this. My life and reason are the very least things which hang in the balance. I dare not tell my father, for he could not grasp the whole thing. But I have told him of my danger, and he has 4 men from a detective agency watching the house. I don't know how much good they can be, for they have against them forces which even you could scarcely envisage or acknowledge. So come quickly if you wish to see me alive and hear how you may help to save the cosmos from stark hell. Any time will do. I shall not be out of the house. Don't telephone ahead, for there is no telling who or what may try to intercept you. And let us pray to whatever gods there be that nothing may prevent this meeting. In utmost gravity and desperation, Charles Dexter Ward. P.S. Shoot Dr. Allen on sight and dissolve his body in acid. Don't burn it. Dr. Willett received this note about 10:30 a.m. and immediately arranged to spare the whole late afternoon and evening for the momentous talk, letting it extend on into the night as long as might be necessary. He planned to arrive about 4 o'clock, and through all the intervening hours was so engulfed in every sort of wild speculation that most of his tasks were mechanically performed. Maniacal as the letter would have sounded to a stranger, Willett had seen too much of Charles Ward's oddities to dismiss it as sheer raving. That something very subtle, ancient, and horrible was hovering about, he felt quite sure, and the reference to Dr. Allen could almost be comprehended in view of what Pawtuxet gossip said of Ward's enigmatic colleague. Willett had never seen the man, but had heard much of his aspect and bearing, and could not but wonder what sort of eyes those much-discussed dark glasses might conceal. Promptly at 4, Dr. Willett presented himself at the Ward residence, but found to his annoyance that Charles had not adhered to his determination to remain indoors. The guards were there, but said that the young man seemed to have lost part of his timidity. He had that morning done much apparently frightening arguing and protesting over the telephone, one of the detectives said, replying to some unknown voice with phrases such as, "I am very tired and must rest a while. I can't receive anyone for some time, you'll have to excuse me. Please postpone a decisive action till we can arrange some sort of compromise." Or, "I'm very sorry, but I must take a complete vacation from everything. I'll talk with you later." Then, apparently gaining boldness through meditation, he had slipped out so quietly that no one had seen him depart, or knew that he had gone, until he returned about 1 o'clock and entered the house without a word. He had gone upstairs, where a bit of his fear must have surged back, for he was heard to cry out in a highly terrified fashion upon entering his library, afterward trailing off into a kind of choking gasp. When, however, the butler had gone to inquire what the trouble was, he had appeared at the door with a great show of boldness, and had silently gestured the man away in a manner that terrified him unaccountably. Then he had evidently done some rearranging of his shelves, for a great clattering and thumping and creaking ensued, after which he had reappeared and left at once. Willett inquired whether or not any message had been left, but was told that there was none. The butler seemed queerly disturbed about something in Charles' appearance and manner, and asked solicitously if there was any hope for a cure of his disordered nerves. Thank you for the follow, Midnight Warren. Welcome to the stream. For almost 2 hours, Dr. Willett waited vainly in Charles Ward's library, watching the dusty shelves with their wide gaps where books had been removed, and smiling grimly at the paneled overmantel on the north wall, whence a year before the suave features of old Joseph Curwen had looked mildly down. After a time the shadows began to gather, and the sunset cheer gave place to a vague growing terror which fled shadow-like before the night. Mr. Ward finally arrived, and showed much surprise and anger at his son's absence after all the pains which had been taken to guard him. He had not known of Charles' appointment, and promised to notify Willett when the youth returned. In bidding the doctor good night, he expressed his utter perplexity at his son's condition, and urged his caller to do all he could to restore the boy to normal poise. Willett was glad to escape from that library, for something frightful and unholy seemed to haunt it, as if the vanished picture had left behind a legacy of evil. He had never liked that picture, and even now, strong-nerved though he was, there lurked a quality in its vacant panel which made him feel an urgent need to get out into the pure air as soon as possible. Yes, more campfire buddies. Part 3. The next morning, Willett received a message from the senior ward, saying that Charles was still absent. Mr. Ward mentioned that Dr. Allen had telephoned him to say that Charles would remain at Pawtuxet for some time, and that he must not be disturbed. This was necessary because Allen himself was suddenly called away for an indefinite period, leaving the researchers in need of Charles' constant oversight. Charles sent his best wishes, and regretted any bother his abrupt change of plans might have caused. In listening to this message, Mr. Ward heard Dr. Allen's voice for the first time, and it seemed to excite some vague and elusive memory which could not be actually placed, and which was disturbing to the point of fearfulness. Faced by these baffling and contradictory reports, Dr. Willett was frankly at a loss what to do. The frantic earnestness of Charles' note was not to be denied, yet what could one think of its writer's immediate violation of his own expressed policy? Young Ward had written that his delvings had become blasphemous and menacing, that they and his bearded colleague must be extirpated at any cost, and that he himself would never return to their final scene. Yet according to latest advices, he had forgotten all this and was back in the thick of the mystery. Common sense bade one leave the youth alone with his freakishness, yet some deeper instinct would not permit the impression of that frenzied letter to subside. Willett read it over again, and could not make its essence sound as empty and insane as both his bombastic verbiage and its lack of fulfillment would seem to imply. Its terror was too profound and real, and in conjunction with what the doctor already knew evoked too vivid hints of monstrosities from beyond time and space to permit of any cynical explanation. There were nameless horrors abroad, and no matter how little one might be able to get at them, one ought to stand prepared for any sort of action at any time. For over a week Dr. Willett pondered on the dilemma which seemed thrust upon him, and became more and more inclined to pay Charles a call at the Pawtuxet bungalow. No friend of the youth had ever ventured to storm this forbidden retreat, and even his father knew of its interior only from such descriptions as he chose to give. But Willett felt that some direct conversations with his patient was necessary. Mr. Ward had been receiving brief and non-committal type notes from his son, and said that Mrs. Ward in her Atlantic City retirement had no better word. So at length the doctor resolved to act, and despite a curious sensation inspired by old legends of Joseph Curwen, and by more recent revelations and warnings from Charles Ward, set boldly out for the bungalow on the bluff above the river. Willett had visited the spot before through sheer curiosity, though of course never entering the house or proclaiming his presence, hence knew exactly the route to take. Driving out Broad Street one early afternoon towards the end of February in his small motor, He thought oddly of the grim party which had taken that selfsame road 157 years before on a terrible errand which none might ever comprehend. The ride through the city's decaying fringe was short, and trim Edgewood and sleepy Pawtuxet presently spread out ahead. Willett turned to the right down Lockwood Street and drove his car as far along that rural road as he could, then alighted and walked north to where the bluff towered above the lovely bends of the river and the sweep of misty downlands beyond. Houses were still few here, and there was no mistaking the isolated bungalow with its concrete garage on a high point of land at his left. Stepping briskly up the neglected gravel walk, he rapped at the door with a firm hand, and spoke with a tremor to the evil Portuguese mulatto who opened it to the width of a crack. He must, he said, see Charles Ward at once on vitally important business. No excuse would be accepted, and a repulse would mean only a full report on the matter to the elder Ward. The mulatto still hesitated, and pushed against the door when Willett attempted to open it, but the doctor merely raised his voice and renewed his demands. Then there came from the dark interior a husky whisper which somehow chilled the hearer through and through, though he did not know why he feared it. "Let him in, Tony," it said. "We may as well talk now as ever." But disturbing as was the whisper, the greater fear was that which immediately followed. The floor creaked, and the speaker hove in sight, and the owner of those strange and resonant tones was seen to be no other than Charles Dexter Ward. The minuteness with which Dr. Willett recalled and recorded his conversation of that afternoon is due to the importance he assigns to this particular period. For at last he concedes a vital change in Charles Dexter Ward's mentality, and believes that the youth now spoke with a brain hopelessly alien to the brain whose growth he had watched for 26 years. Controversy with Dr. Lyman has compelled him to be very specific, and he definitely dates the madness of Charles Ward from the time the typewritten note began to reach his parents. Those notes are not in Ward's normal style, not even in the style of that last frantic letter to Willett. Instead, they are strange and archaic, as if the snapping of the writer's mind had released a flood of tendencies and impressions picked up unconsciously through boyhood antiquarianism. There is an obvious effort to be modern, but the spirit and occasionally the language are those of the past. The past, too, was evident in Ward's every tone and gesture as he received the doctor in that shadowy bungalow. He bowed, and motioned Willett to a seat, and began to speak abruptly in that strange whisper which he sought to explain at the very outset. "I am grown phthisical," he began, "from this cursed river air. You must excuse my speech. I suppose you are come from my father to see what ails me, and I hope you will say nothing to alarm him." Willett was studying these scraping tones with extreme care, but studying even more closely the face of the speaker. Something, he felt, was wrong, and he thought of what the family had told him about the fright of that Yorkshire butler one night. He wished it was not so dark, but did not request any more blind be opened. Instead, he merely asked Ward why he had belied the frantic note of little more than a week before. "I was coming to that," the host acknowledged. "You must know I'm in a very bad state of nerves, and do and say queer things I cannot account for. As I have told you often, I am on the edge of great matters, and the bigness of them has a way of making me lightheaded. Any man might well be frightened of what I have found, but I am not to be put off for long. It was a dunce to have that guard and stick at home, for having gone this far, my place is here. I am not well spoke of by my prying neighbors, and perhaps I was led by weakness to believe myself what they say of me. There is no evil to any in what I do, so long as I do it rightly. Have the goodness to wait 6 months, and I'll show you what will pay your patience well. You may as well know I have a way of learning old matters from things surer than books, and I'll leave you to judge the importance of what I can give to history, philosophy, and the arts by reason of the doors I have access to. My ancestor had all of this when those witless peeping toms came and murdered him. I now have it again, or am coming very imperfectly to have a part of it. This time nothing must happen, and least of all through any idiot fears of my own. Pray forget all I writ you, sir, and have no fear of this place or any in it. Dr. Allen is a man of fine parts, and I owe him an apology for anything ill I have said of him. I wish I had no need to spare him, but there were things he had to do elsewhere. His zeal is equal to mine in all those matters, and I suppose that when I feared the work, I feared him too as my greatest helper in it. Ward paused, and the doctor hardly knew what to say or think. He felt foolish in the face of this calm repudiation of the letter, and yet there clung to him the fact that while the present discourse was strange and alien and indubitably mad, the note itself had been tragic in its naturalness and likeness to the Charles Ward he knew. Willett now tried to turn the talk on early matters and recall to the youth some past events which would restore a familiar mood, but in this process he obtained only the most grotesque results. It was the same with all the alienists later on. Important sections of Charles Ward's store of mental images, mainly those touching modern times and his own personal life, had been unaccountably expunged, whilst all the amassed antiquarianism of his youth had welled up from some profound subconsciousness to engulf the contemporary and the individual. The youth's intimate knowledge of elder things was abnormal and unholy, and he tried his best to hide it. When Willett would mention some favorite object of his boyhood archaistic studies, he would often shed by pure accident such a light as no normal mortal could conceivably be expected to possess, and the doctor shuddered as the glib allusion glided by. It was not wholesome to know so much about the way the fat sheriff's wig fell off as he leaned over at the play in Mr. Douglas's Histrionic Academy in King Street on the 11th of February, 1762, which fell on a Thursday, or about how the actors cut the text of Steele's Conscious Lover so badly that one was almost glad the Baptist-ridden legislature closed the theater a fortnight later. That Thomas Sabine's Boston coach was damned uncomfortable, old letters may well have told, but what healthy antiquarian could recall how the creaking of a Pentus Olney's new signboard, the gaudy crown he set up after he took to calling his tavern the Crown Coffee House, was exactly like the first few notes of the new jazz piece all the radios in Pawtuxet were playing. Ward, however, would not be quizzed long in this vein. Jack, hey! Check me out. I am so glad to see you here. How are you, friend? If you are interested in sound therapy and relaxation, you definitely need to go and follow Chat. Yes, she is our overlord. Bunsen bless us. Modern and personal topics he waved aside quite summarily, whilst regarding antique affairs he soon showed the plainest boredom. What he wished clearly enough was only to satisfy his visitor enough to make him depart without the intention of returning. To this end he offered to show Willett the entire house, and at once proceeded to lead the doctor through every room from cellar to attic. Willett looked sharply, but noted that the visible books were far too few and trivial ever to have filled the wide gaps on Ward's shelves at home, and that the meager so-called laboratory was the flimsiest sort of a blind. Clearly there were a library and a laboratory elsewhere, but just where it was impossible to say. Essentially defeated in his quest for something he could not name, Willett returned to town before evening and told the senior Ward everything which had occurred. They agreed that the youth must be definitely out of his mind, but decided that nothing drastic need to be done just then. Above all, Mrs. Ward must be kept in as complete as ignorance as her own son's strange type notes would permit. Mr. Ward now determined to call in person upon his son, making it wholly a surprise visit. Dr. Willett took him in his car one evening, guiding him to within sight of the bungalow and waiting patiently for his return. The session was a long one, and the father emerged in a very saddened and perplexed state. His reception had developed much like Willett's, save that Charles had been an excessively long time in appearing after the visitor had forced his way into the hall and sent the Portuguese away with an imperative demand. And in the bearing of the altered son there was no trace of filial affection. The lights had been dim, yet even so the youth had complained that they dazzled him outrageously. He had not spoken out loud at all, averring that his throat was in very poor condition, but in his hoarse whisper there was a quality so vaguely disturbing that Mr. Ward could not banish it from his mind. Now definitely leagued together to do all they could towards the youth's mental salvation, Mr. Ward and Dr. Willett set about collecting every scrap of data which the case might afford. Pawtuxet gossip was the first item they studied, and this was relatively easy to glean since both had friends in that region. Dr. Willett obtained the most rumors because people talked more frankly to him than to a parent of the central figure, and from all he heard he could tell that young Ward's life had become indeed a strange one. Common tongues would not disassociate his household from the vampirism of the previous summer, while the nocturnal comings and goings of the motor trucks provided their share of dark speculation. Local tradesmen spoke of the queerness of the orders brought them by the evil-looking mulatto, and in particular of the inordinate amounts of meat and fresh blood secured from the 2 butcher shops in the immediate neighborhood. For a household of only 3, these quantities were quite absurd. Time zones are our enemy. I'm telling you, we need to everybody be on universal time. These time zones are the death of us. Then there was the matter of the sounds beneath the earth. Reports of these things were harder to pin down, but all the vague hints tallied in certain basic essentials. Noises of a ritual nature positively existed, and at times when the bungalow was dark. They might, of course, have come from the known cellar, but rumor insisted that there were deeper and more spreading crypts. Recalling the ancient tales of Joseph Curwen's catacombs, and assuming for granted that the present bungalow had been selected because of its situation on the old Curwen site, as revealed in one or another of the documents found behind the picture, Willett and Mr. Ward gave this phase of the gossip much attention, and searched many times without success for the door in the river bank which the old manuscript mentioned. As to popular opinions of the bungalow's various inhabitants, it was soon plain that the brava Portuguese was loathed, the bearded and spectacled Mr. Allen feared, and the pallid young scholar disliked to a profound extent. During the last week or 2, Ward had obviously changed much, abandoning his attempts at affability and speaking only in hoarse, but oddly repellent whispers on the few occasions that he ventured forth. Such were the shreds and fragments gathered here and there, and over these Mr. Ward and Dr. Willett held many long and serious conferences. They strove to exercise deduction, induction, and constructive imagination to their utmost extent, and to correlate every known fact of Charles' later life, including the frantic letter which the doctor now showed the father, with the meager documentary evidence available concerning old Joseph Curwen. They would have given much for a glimpse of the papers Charles had found, for very clearly the key to the youth's madness lay in what he had learned of the ancient wizard and his doings. You see, how the universal time will work is there will be a giant dome. There'll be a giant dome, and the sky will be projected onto it, and artificial sunlight will tell you when it's day and night. Yes. Yeah, it would be nice if we could all spend more time together, but I mean, I guess it's the blessing and the curse of the internet. It brings people together from so far away, but we still have time zones. So we have to cherish these times that we can all be here. All right, part 4. And yet, after all, it was from no step of Mr. Ward's or Dr. Willett's that the next move in this singular case proceeded. The father and the physician, rebuffed and confused by a shadow too shapeless and intangible to combat, had rested uneasily on their oars while the typed notes of young Ward to his parents grew fewer and fewer. Then came the first of the month with its customary financial adjustments, and the clerks at certain banks began a peculiar shaking of heads and telephoning from one to the other. Officials who knew Charles Ward by sight went down to the bungalow to ask why every check of his appearing at this juncture was a clumsy forgery, and were reassured less than they ought to have been when the youth hoarsely exclaimed that his hand had lately been so much affected by a nervous shock as to make normal writing impossible. He could, he said, form no written characters at all except with great difficulty, and could prove it by the fact that he had been forced to type all his recent letters, even those to his father and mother, who would bear out the assertion. What made the investigators pause in confusion was not this circumstance alone, for that was nothing unprecedented or fundamentally suspicious, nor even the Pawtuxet gossip, of which one or two of them had caught echoes. It was the muddled discourse of the young man which nonplussed them, implying as it did a virtually total loss of memory concerning important monetary matters which he had had at his fingertips only a month or two before. Something was wrong, for despite the apparent coherence and rationality of his speech, there could be no normal reason for this ill-concealed blankness on vital points. Moreover, although none of these men knew Ward well, they could not help observing the change in his language and manner. They had heard he was an antiquarian, but even the most hopeless antiquarians do not make daily use of obsolete phraseology and gestures. Although this combination of horseless, palsied hands, bad memory, and altered speech and bearing must represent some disturbance or malady of genuine gravity, which no doubt formed the basis of the prevailing odd rumors, and after their departure the party of officials decided that talk with the senior Ward was imperative. See, my pact is that if I ever get stupid rich, I'm going to buy an island, and everyone that I care about will come live there with me, and all of my friends, and we will have a giant dome over it. Because hurricanes. So on the 6th of March, 1928, there was a long and serious conference in Mr. Ward's office, after which the utterly bewildered father summoned Dr. Willett in a kind of helpless resignation. Willett looked over the strained and awkward signatures of the checks and compared them in his mind with the penmanship of that last frantic note. Certainly the change was radical and profound, and yet there was something damnably familiar about the new writing. It had crabbed and archaic tendencies of a very curious sort, and seemed to result from a type of stroke utterly different from that which the youth had always used. It was strange, but where had he seen it before? On the whole, it was obvious that Charles was insane. Of that there could be no doubt. And since it appeared unlikely that he could handle his property or continue to deal with the outside world much longer, something must quickly be done towards his oversight and possible cure. It was then that the alienists were called in. Doctors Peck and Waite of Providence and Dr. Lyman of Boston, to whom Mr. Ward and Dr. Willett gave the most exhaustive possible history of the case, and who conferred at length in the now unused library of their young patient, examining what books and papers of his were left in order to gain some further notion of his habitual mental cast. After scanning this material and examining the ominous note to Willett, they all agreed that Charles Ward's studies had been enough to unseat, or at least to warp, any ordinary intellect, and wished most heartily that they could see his most intimate volumes and documents. But this latter they knew they could do, if at all, only after a scene at the bungalow itself. Willett now reviewed the whole case with febrile energy, it being at this time at the bungalow, the statements of the workmen who had seen Charles find the Kirwan documents, and that he collated the incidents of the destroyed newspaper items, looking up the latter at the journal office. You could open a bar called Anything You Want on my island, Yost. And yes, because hurricanes. See, that is my fear with an island, is like hurricanes exist. And it would be awful if a giant wave wiped out my island. We would have an island and we would all live on it, under a dome. And yeah, I know the dome presents, because then there would be like no rain. We kind of need rain. I haven't worked through all the details yet. But there will be an island. Yost will have a bar. It will be 5 o'clock always. You live! Yay! I'm glad you made it here. We are finishing the longest short story ever. I will add you to the list. You can't trust the stable states, though, because they're hiding something. And eventually they will have a disaster. See, everybody's here. Everybody's here. On Thursday, the 8th of March, Doctors Willett, Peck, Lyman, and Waite, accompanied by Mr. Ward, paid the youth their momentous call, making no concealment of their object in questioning the now acknowledged patient with extreme minuteness. Charles, though he was inordinately long in answering the summons, and was still redolent of strange and noxious laboratory odors when he did finally make his agitated appearance, proved a far from recalcitrant subject, and admitted freely that his memory and balance had suffered somewhat from close application to abstruse studies. He offered no resistance when his removal to other quarters was insisted upon, and seemed, indeed, to display a high degree of intelligence as apart from mere memory. His conduct would have sent his interviewers away in bafflement had not the persistent archaic trend of his speech and unmistakable replacement of modern by ancient ideas in his consciousness marked him out as one definitely removed from the normal. Of his work he would say no more to the group of doctors than he had formerly said to his family and to Dr. Willett, and his frantic note of the previous month he dismissed as mere nerves and hysteria. He insisted that this shadowy bungalow possessed no library or laboratory beyond the visible ones, and waxed abstruse in explaining the absence from the house of such odors as now saturated all his clothing. Neighborhood gossip he attributed to nothing more than the cheap inventiveness of baffled curiosity. Of the whereabouts of Dr. Allen, he said he did not feel at liberty to speak definitely, but assured his inquisitors that the bearded and spectacled man would return when needed. In paying off the solid brava who resisted all questioning by the visitors, and in closing the bungalow which still seemed to hold such nighted secrets, Ward showed no sign of nervousness save a barely noticed tendency to pause as though listening for something very faint. He was apparently animated by a calmly philosophic resignation, as if his removal were the merest transient incident which would cause the least trouble if facilitated and disposed of once and for all. It was clear that he trusted to his obviously unimpaired keenness of absolute mentality to overcome all the embarrassments into which his twisted memory, his lost voice and handwriting, and his secretive and eccentric behavior had led him. His mother, it was agreed, was not to be told of the change, his father supplying typed notes in his name. Ward was taken to the restfully and picturesque situated private hospital maintained by Dr. Waite on Connecticut Island in the Bay, and subjected to the closest scrutiny and questioning by all the physicians connected with the case. It was then that the physical oddities were noticed. The slackened metabolism, the altered skin, and the disproportionate neural reactions. Dr. Willett was the most perturbed of the various examiners, for he had attended Ward all his life, and could appreciate the terrible keenness the extent of his physical disorganization. Even the familiar olive mark on his hip was gone, while on his chest was a great black mole, or cicatrice, which had never been there before, and which made Millett wonder whether the youth had ever submitted to any of the witch markings reputed to be inflicted at certain unwholesome nocturnal meetings in wild and lonely places. The doctor could not keep his mind off a certain transcribed witch trial record from Salem, which Charles had shown him in the old non-secretive days, and which read, Mr. G.B. on that night put ye divil his mark upon Bridget S. Jonathan A., Simon O., Deliverance W., Joseph C., Susan P., Mehitable C., and Deborah B. Ward's face, too, troubled him horribly, till at length he suddenly discovered why he was horrified. For above the man's right eye was something he had never previously noticed, a small scar or pit, precisely like that in the crumbling painting of old Joseph Curwen, and perhaps attesting some hideous ritualistic inoculation to which both had submitted at a certain stage of their occult careers. Why are we panicking? What are you doing? Are we all gonna die in 38 minutes? Because if so, I better read a lot faster to get through this story. While Ward himself was puzzling all the doctors at the hospital, a very strict watch was kept on all mail addressed either to him or to Dr. Allen, which Mr. Ward had ordered delivered at the family home. Willett had predicted that very little would be found, since any communications of a vital nature would probably have been exchanged by messenger. But in the latter part of March there did come a letter from Prague for Dr. Allen, which gave both the doctor and the father deep thought. It was in a very crabbed and archaic hand, and though clearly not the effort of a foreigner, showed almost as singular a departure from modern English as the speech of young Ward himself. It read, Kleinstrasse 11, Altstadt, Prague, 11th February 1928. Brother in Almusin Metroton. I this day received ye mention of what came up from the salts I sent you. It was wrong, and means clearly that ye headstones have been changed when Barnabas got me the specimen. It is often so, as ye must be sensible of from the thing ye got from ye King's Chapel ground in 1769, and what H got from old Burrig's Point in 1690, that was like to end him. I got such a thing in Egypt 75 years gone, from the which came that scare ye boy put saw me on here in 1924. As I told you long ago, do not call up that which you cannot put down, either from dead salts or out of ye spheres beyond. Have ye words for laying at all times ready, and stop not to be sure when there is any doubt of whom you have. Stones are all changed now in 9 grounds out of 10. You are never sure till you question. I this day heard from H. who has had trouble with the soldiers. He is like to be sorry Transylvania is passed from Hungary to Romania, and would change his seat if the castle weren't so full of what we know. But of this he hath doubtless writ you. In my next sending there will be somewhat from a hill tomb from ye east that will delight you greatly. Meanwhile forget not that I am desirous of B.F. if you can possibly get him for me. You know G in Philadelphia better than I. Have him up first if you will, but do not use him so hard, he will be difficult, for I must speak to him in ye end. Yog Sothoth Neblod Zin Simon O. Which place on earth is the safest place away from natural disasters? If you can handle the heat, or if we could get some, like, giant air conditioning, I would say the desert. I mean, you never hear about anything going on in the Sahara. Or the, oh my god, my little brain has just gone blank. But the deserts of Nevada. The moon is not on Earth. I mean, either nothing ever happens in the deserts, or there's just nobody out there to tell us about it. Could be either one, honestly. But yes, we could build a retreat in the desert with like a giant air conditioner. The moon is going to impact the Earth? No, it won't, silly. Because we're going to blow the moon up. I saw that movie. We blow the moon up, and then we just have like a weird looking half moon up in space. Mr. Ward and Dr. Willett paused in utter chaos before this apparent bit of unrelieved insanity. Only by degrees did they absorb what it seemed to imply. So the absent Dr. Allen, and not Charles Ward, had come to be the leading spirit at Pawtuxet? That must explain the wild reference and denunciation in the youth's last frantic letter. And what of this addressing of the bearded and spectacled stranger as Mr. J.C.? There was no escaping the inference, but there are limits to possible monstrosity. Who was Simon O.? The old man Ward had visited in Prague 4 years previously? Perhaps, but in the centuries behind there had been another Simon O. Simon Orne, alias Jedediah of Salem, who vanished in 1771, and whose peculiar handwriting Dr. Willett now unmistakably recognized from the photostatic copies of the Orne formulae which Charles had once shown him. What horrors and mysteries, what contradictions and contraventions of nature, had come back after a century and a half to harass old Providence with her clustered spires and domes? The father and the old physician, virtually at a loss what to do or think, went to see Charles at the hospital, and questioned him as delicately as they could about Dr. Allen, about the Prague visit, and about what he had learned of Simon or Jebediah Orne of Salem. To all these inquiries the youth was politely non-committal, merely barking in his hoarse whisper that he had found Dr. Allen to have a remarkable spiritual rapport with certain souls from the past, and that any correspondence the bearded man might have in Prague would probably be similarly gifted. When they left, Mr. Ward and Dr. Willett realized to their chagrin that they had really been the ones under catechism, and that without imparting anything vital himself, the confined youth had adroitly pumped them of everything the Prague letters had contained. Doctors Peck, Waite, and Lyman were not inclined to attach much importance to the strange correspondence of young Ward's companion, for they knew the tendency of kindred eccentrics and monomaniacs to band together, and believed that Charles or Alan had merely unearthed an expatriated counterpart. Perhaps one who had seen Orne's handwriting and copied it in an attempt to pose as the bygone character's reincarnation. Alan himself was perhaps a similar case, and may have persuaded the youth into accepting him as an avatar of the long-dead Kerwin. Such things had been known before, and on the same basis the hard-headed doctors disposed of Willet's growing disquiet about Charles Ward's present handwriting, as studied from unpremeditated specimens obtained by various ruses. Willet thought he had placed its odd familiarity at last, and that what it vaguely resembled was the bygone penmanship of old Joseph Kerwin himself. But this the other physicians regarded as a phase of imitativeness only to be expected in a mania of this sort, and refused to grant it any importance either favorable or unfavorable. Recognizing this prosaic attitude in his colleagues, Willett advised Mr. Ward to keep to himself the letter which arrived for Dr. Allen on the 2nd of April from Raucous, Transylvania, in a handwriting so intensely and fundamentally like that of the Hutchinson cipher that both father and physician paused in awe before breaking the seal. This read as follows. Castle Ferenczi, 7 March 1928. Dear C, had a squad of 20 militia up to talk about what the country folks say. Must dig deeper and have less heard. These Romanians plague me damnably, being officious and particular when you could buy a Magyar off with a drink and food. Last month M got me ye sarcophagus of ye 5 sphinxes from ye Acropolis, where he whom I called up said it would be, and I have had 3 talks with what was therein inhumed. It will go to S.O. in Prague directly, and thence to you. It is stubborn, but you know ye way with such. Ye show wisdom in having less about than before, and there was no need to keep the guards in shape and eating off their heads, and it made much to be found in case of trouble, as ye too well know. You can now move and work elsewhere with no killing trouble, if needful, though I hope no thing will soon force you to so bothersome a course. I rejoice that you traffic not so much with those outside, for there was ever a mortal peril in it, and you were sensible what it did when you asked protection of one not disposed to give it. You excel me in getting your formulae so another may say them with success, but Borellus fancied it would be so if just ye right words were had. Does your boy use 'em often? I regret that he grows squeamish, as I feared he would when I had him here nigh 15 months, but am sensible ye know how to work with him. You can't say him down with your formula, for that will work only upon such as ye other formula hath called up from salts, but you still have strong hands and knife and pistol, and graves are not hard to dig, nor acids loath to burn. O says you have promised him B.F. I must have him after B goes to you soon, and may he give up what you wish of that dark thing below Memphis. Employ care in what you call up, and beware of your boy. It will be ripe in a year's time to have up ye legions from underneath, and then there are no bounders to for what shall be ours. Have confidence in what I say, for ye know and I have had these 150 years more than you to consult these matters. Nefenka he Hadath, Edward H. For J. Kerwin, Esquire, Providence. So we just need to build our town like on the highest point ever. We will build a town. We'll build our town, and it will not flood, we will be safe, I promise. We will have an island with a bar and a dome. Yes. But if Willett and Mr. Ward refrained from showing this letter to the alienists, they did not refrain from acting upon it themselves. No amount of learned sophistry could convert the fact that the strangely bearded and spectacled Dr. Allen, of whom Charles' frantic letter had spoken as such a monstrous menace, was in close and sinister correspondence with two inexplicable creatures whom Ward had visited in his travels, and who plainly claimed to be survivals or avatars of Curwen's old Salem colleagues. That he was regarding himself as the reincarnation of Joseph Curwen, and that he entertained, or was at least advised to entertain, murderous designs against a boy who could scarcely be other than Charles Ward. There was organized horror afoot, and no matter who had started it, the missing Allen was by this time at the bottom of it. Therefore, thanking heaven that Charles was now safe in the hospital, Mr. Ward lost no time in engaging detectives to learn all they could of the cryptic bearded doctor. Finding whence he had come, and what Pawtuxet knew of him, and if possible discovering his current whereabouts. Supplying the men with one of the bungalow keys which Charles yielded up, he urged them to explore Allen's vacant room, which had been identified when the patient's belongings had been packed, obtaining any clues they could from any effects he might have left about it. Mr. Ward talked with the detectives in his son's old library, and they felt a marked relief when they left it at last, for there seemed to hover about the place a vague aura of evil. Perhaps it was what they had heard of the infamous old wizard, whose picture had once stared from the panel overmantel. And perhaps it was something different and irrelevant. But in any case, they all half sensed an intangible miasma which centered in that carven vestige of an older dwelling, and which at times almost rose to the intensity of a material emanation. I'm worried about what y'all are gonna do on the island. I'll be drinking and doing weed and doing acid. If you have too much fun, the government will find us. You have to be quiet about those things. We will have all the weed. We will have all the weed. All the weed, all the drugs. It will be awesome. Happiest place on earth. And Disney will have nothing on us. Okay, we have drinking our water. What else are you gonna do on an island? Well, we're gonna have Wi-Fi. We will have the internet. We would have to get an island down in international waters. Declare ourselves a sovereign nation. Chapter 5. A Nightmare and a Cataclysm. There is more left than I thought there was. That's okay. Part 1. And now swiftly followed that hideous experience, which had left its indelible mark of fear on the soul of Marinus Bicknell Willett, and had added a decade to the visible age of one whose youth was even then far behind. Dr. Willett had conferred at length with Mr. Ward, and had come to an agreement with him on several points, which both felt the alienists would ridicule. There was, they conceded, a terrible movement alive in the world, whose direct connection with necromancy even older than the Salem witchcraft could not be doubted. That at least 2 living men, and one other of whom they dared not think, were in absolute possession of minds or personalities which had functioned as early as 1690 or before, was likewise almost unassailably proved, even in the face of all known natural laws. What these horrible creatures, and Charles Ward as well, were doing or trying to do seemed fairly clear from their letters, and from every bit of light, both old and new, which had filtered in upon the case. They were robbing the tombs of all the ages, including some of the world's wisest and greatest men, in the hopes of recovering from the bygone ashes some vestige of the consciousness and lore which had once animated and informed them. The hideous traffic was going on among these nightmare ghouls, where illustrious bones were bartered with the calm calculativeness of schoolboys swapping books. And from what was extorted from this century dust there was anticipated a power and a wisdom beyond anything which the cosmos had ever seen, concentrated in one man or group. They had found unholy ways to keep their brains alive, either in the same body or different bodies, and had evidently achieved a way of tapping the consciousness of the dead whom they gathered together. There had, it seems, been some truth in chemical old Borellus, when he wrote of preparing from even the most antique remains certain essential salts, from which the shade of a long dead living thing might be raised up. There was a formula for evoking such a shade, and another for putting it down, and it had now been so perfected that it could be taught successfully. One must be careful about evocations, for the markers of old graves are not always accurate. Willett and Mr. Ward shivered as they passed from conclusion to conclusion. Things, presences or voices of some sort, could be drawn down from unknown places as well as from the grave, and in this process also one must be careful. Joseph Curwen had indubitably evoked many forbidden things, and as for Charles, what might one think of him? What forces outside the spheres had reached him from Joseph Curwen's day and turned his mind on forgotten things? He had been led to find certain directions, and he had used them. He had talked with the man of horror in Prague, and stayed long with the creature in the mountains of Transylvania. And he must have found the grave of Joseph Curwen at last. The newspaper item and what his mother had heard in the night were too significant to overlook. Then he had summoned something, and it must have come. That mighty voice aloft on Good Friday, and those different tones in the locked attic library. What were they like in their depth and hollowness? Was there not here some awful foreshadowing of the dreaded stranger Dr. Allen in his spectral baths? Yes, that was what Mr. Ward had felt with vague horror in his single talk with the man, if man it were, over the telephone. What hellish consciousness or voice, what morbid shade or presence, had come to answer Charles Ward's secret rites behind that locked door? Those voices heard in argument must have it read for 3 months. Good God, was that not just before the vampirism broke out? The rifling of Ezra Whedon's ancient grave, and the cries later at Patuxet. Whose mind had planned the vengeance and rediscovered the shunned seat of elder blasphemies? And then the bungalow and the bearded stranger, and the gossip and the fear? The final madness of Charles neither father nor doctor could attempt to explain, but they did feel sure that the mind of Joseph Curwen had come to earth again and was following its ancient morbidities. Was demonic possession in truth a possibility? Allen had something to do with it, and the detectives must find out more about one whose existence menaced the young man's life. In the meantime, since the existence of some vast crypt beneath the bungalow seemed virtually beyond dispute, some effort must be made to find it. Willett and Mr. Ward, conscious of the skeptical attitude of the alienists, resolved during their final conference to undertake a joint secret exploration of unparalleled thoroughness, and agreed to meet at the bungalow on the following morning with the valises and with certain tools and accessories suited to architectural search and underground exploration. The morning of April 6th dawned clear, and both explorers were at the bungalow by 10 o'clock. Mr. Ward had the key, and an entry and cursory survey were made. From the disordered condition of Dr. Allen's room, it was obvious that the detectives had been there before, and the later searchers hoped that they had found some clue which might prove of value. Of course, the main business lay in the cellar, so thither they descended without much delay, again making the circuit which each had vainly made before in the presence of the mad young owner. For a time everything seemed baffling, every inch of the earthen floor and stone walls having so solid and innocuous an aspect that the thought of a yawning aperture was scarcely to be entertained. Willett reflected that since the original cellar was dug without knowledge of any catacombs beneath, the beginning of the passage would represent the strictly modern delving of young Ward and his associates, where they had probed for the ancient vaults whose rumors could have reached them by no wholesome means. The doctor tried to put himself in Charles' place to see how a delver would be likely to start, but could not get inspiration from this method. Then he decided on elimination as a policy for the whole subterranean surface, both vertical and horizontal, trying to account for every inch separately. He was soon substantially narrowed down, and at last had nothing left but the small platform before the wash-tubs, which he had tried once before in vain. Now experimenting in every possible way, and exerting a double strength, he himself found that the top did indeed turn, and slide horizontally on a corner pivot. Beneath it lay a trim concrete surface with an iron manhole, to which Mr. Ward at once rushed with excited zeal. The cover was not hard to lift, and the father had quite removed it when Willett noticed the queerness of his aspect. He was swaying and nodding dizzily, and in the gust of noxious air which swept up from the black pit beneath, the doctor soon recognized ample cause. In a moment Dr. Willett had his fainting companion on the floor above, and was reviving him with cold water. Mr. Ward responded feebly, but it could be seen that the mephic blast from the crypt had in some way gravely sickened him. Wishing to take no chances, Willett hastened out to Broad Street for a taxicab, and had soon dispatched the sufferer home despite his weak-voiced protests, after which he produced an electric torch, covered his nostrils with a band of sterile gauze, and descended once more to peer into the new-found depths. The foul air had now slightly abated, and Willett was able to send a beam of light down the Stygian hole. For about 10 feet he saw it was a sheer cylindrical drop with concrete walls and an iron ladder, after which the hole appeared to strike a flight of old stone steps, which must have originally emerged to earth somewhat southwest of the present building. Part 2. Willett freely admits that for a moment the memory of the old Curwen legends kept him from climbing down alone into that malodorous gulf. He could not help thinking of what Luke Fenner had reported on that last monstrous night. Then duty asserted itself, and he made the plunge, carrying a great valise for the removal of whatever papers might prove of supreme importance. Slowly, as befitted one of his years, he descended the ladder and reached the slimy steps below. This was ancient masonry, his torch told him, and upon the dripping walls he saw the unwholesome moss of centuries. Down, down ran the stairs, not spirally, but in 3 abrupt turns, and with such narrowness that 2 men could have passed only with difficulty. He had counted about 30 when a sound reached him very faintly, and after that he did not feel disposed to count any more. It was a godless sound, one of those low-keyed, insidious outrages of nature which are not meant to be. To call it a dull wail, a doom-dragged whine, or a hopeless howl of chorused anguish and stricken flesh without mind would be to miss its most quintessential loathsomeness and soul-sickening overtones. Was it for this that Ward had seemed to listen on that day he was removed? It was the most shocking thing that Willett had ever heard, and it continued from no determinate point as the doctor reached the bottom of the steps and cast his torchlight around on lofty corridor walls, surmounted by cyclopean vaulting and pierced by numberless black archways. The hall in which he stood was perhaps 14 feet high to the middle of the vaulting, and 10 or 12 feet broad. Its pavement was of large, chipped flagstones, and its walls and roof were of dressed masonry. Its length he could not imagine, for it stretched ahead indefinitely into the blackness. Of the archways, some had doors of the old six-paneled colonial type, whilst others had none. Overcoming the dread induced by the smell and the howling, Willett began to explore these archways one by one, finding beyond them rooms with grindstone ceilings, each of medium size and apparently of bizarre uses. Most of them had fireplaces, the upper courses of whose chimneys would have formed an interesting study in engineering. Never before or since had he seen such instruments or suggestions of instruments as here loomed up on every hand through the burying dust and cobwebs of a century and a half, in many cases evidently shattered as if by the ancient raiders. For many of the chambers seemed wholly untrodden by modern feet, and must have represented the earliest and most obsolete phases of Joseph Curwen's experimentation. Finally, there came a room of obvious modernity, or at least of recent occupancy. There were oil heaters, bookshelves and tables, chairs and cabinets, and a desk piled high with papers of varying antiquity and contemporariness. Candlesticks and oil lamps stood about in several places, and finding a match-safe handy, Willett lighted such as were ready for use. In the fuller gleam, it appeared that this apartment was nothing less than the latest study or library of Charles Ward. Of the books the doctor had seen many before, and a good part of the furniture was plainly come from the Prospect Street mansion. Here and there was a piece well known to Willett, and the sense of familiarity became so great that he half forgot the noisomeness and the wailing, both of which were plainer here than they had been at the foot of the stairs. His first duty, as planning long ahead, was to find and seize any papers which might seem of vital importance, especially those portentous documents found by Charles so long ago behind the picture in Olney Court. As he searched, he perceived how stupendous a task the final unraveling would be. For file on file was stuffed with papers in curious hands and bearing curious designs, so that months or even years might be needed for a thorough deciphering and editing. Once he found large packets of letters with Prague and Rakas postmarks, and in writing clearly recognizable as Orne's and Hutchison's, all of which he took with him as part of the bundle to be removed in his valise. At last, in a locked mahogany cabinet once gracing the ward home, Willett found the batch of old Curwen papers, recognizing them from the reluctant glimpse Charles had granted him so many years ago. The youth had evidently kept them together very much as they had been when first he found them, except all the titles recalled by the workmen were present, except the papers addressed to Orne and Hutchinson, and the cipher with its key. Willett placed the entire lot in his valise and continued his examination of the files. Since young Ward's immediate condition was the greater matter at stake, the closest searching was done among the most obviously recent matter, and in this abundance of contemporary manuscript one very baffling oddity was noted. The oddity was the slight amount in Charles' normal writing, which indeed included nothing more recent than 2 months before. On the other hand, there were literally reams of symbols and formulae, historical notes and philosophical comment, in a crabbed penmanship absolutely identical with the ancient script of Joseph Curwen, though of undeniably modern dating. Plainly, a part of the latter-day program had been a seditious imitation of the old wizard's writing, which Charles seemed to have carried to a marvelous state of perfection. Of any third hand, which might have been Allen's, there was not a trace. If he had indeed come to be the leader, he must have forced young Ward to act as his amanuensis. I don't know what that word means. We're not going to Google it. In this new material, one mystic formula, or rather paraformula, recurred so often that Willett had it by heart before he had half finished his quest. It consisted of 2 parallel columns, the left-hand one surmounted by the archaic symbol called Dragon's Head, and used in almanacs to indicate the ascending node, and the right one headed by a corresponding sign of dragon's tail, or descending node. The appearance of the whole was something like this, and almost unconsciously the doctor realized that the second half was no more than the first written, symbolically backwards, with the exception of the final monosyllables and of the odd name Yog-Sothoth, which he had come to recognize under various spellings from other things he had seen in connection with this horrible matter. The formula were as follows, exactly so, as Willett is abundantly able to testify, and the first one struck an odd note of uncomfortable latent memory in his brain, which he recognized later when reviewing the events of that horrible Good Friday of the previous year. Well, thank you, Yost. We have all learned something, because I don't even know how to say the name. Or say the word, never mind what it means. And then the text in the story is some symbols and some Lovecraftian words. I will just copy it into the chat because I will murder it if I try to write it. And I can't copy? Come on. We can copy and paste. Or we can't. Paste. We can't copy. I am a failure. It copied one line. Okay, well, this is the shit show stream. You would expect nothing less from me, right? So, what? Oh, there's words. There's words I can't pronounce. It's Lovecraft. It's Eldritch, whatever. So we will go on below past the formulas, because I will spend all night trying to say it. It mentions Yog-Sothoth in both of them. So haunting were these formulae, and so frequently did he come upon them, that before the doctor knew it he was repeating them under his breath. Eventually, however, he felt he had secured all the papers he could digest to advantage for the present, hence resolved to examine no more till he could bring the skeptical alienists en masse for an ampler and more systematic raid. He had still to find the hidden laboratory, so leaving his valise in the lighted room, he emerged again into the black, noisome corridor, whose vaulting echoed ceaselessly with that dull and hideous whine. The next few rooms he tried were all abandoned, or filled only with crumbling boxes and ominous-looking leaden coffins, but impressed him deeply with the magnitude of Joseph Curwen's original operations. He thought of the slaves and seamen who had disappeared, of the graves which had been violated in every part of the world, and of what that final raiding party must have seen, and then he decided it was better not to think any more. Once a great stone staircase mounted at his right, and he deduced that this must have reached to one of the Curwen outbuildings, perhaps the famous stone edifice with the high slit-like windows, provided the steps he had descended had led from the steep-roofed farmhouse. Suddenly the walls seemed to fall away ahead, and the stench and the wailing grew stronger. Willett saw that he had come upon a vast open space, so great that his torchlight would not carry across it, and as he advanced he encountered occasional stout pillars supporting the arches of the roof. After a time he reached a circle of pillars grouped like the monoliths of Stonehenge, with a large carved altar on a base of 3 steps in the center, and so curious were the carvings on that altar that he approached to study them with his electric light. But when he saw what they were, he shrank away shuddering, and did not stop to investigate the dark stains which discolored the upper surface and had spread down the sides in occasional thin lines. Instead, he found the distant wall and traced it as it swept round in a gigantic circle, perforated by occasional black doorways and indented by a myriad of shallow cells, with iron gratings and wrist and ankle bonds on chains, fastened to the stone of the concaver masonry. These cells were empty, but still the horrible odor and the dismal moaning continued, more insistent now than ever, and seemingly varied at times by a sort of slippery thumping. Part 3. From that frightful smell and that uncanny noise, Willet's attention could no longer be diverted. Both were plainer and more hideous in the great pillared hall than anywhere else, and carried a vague impression of being far below, even in this dark netherworld of subterranean mystery. Before trying any of the black archways for steps leading further down, the doctor cast his beam of light about the stone-flagged floor. It was very loosely paved, and at irregular intervals there would occur a slab curiously pierced by small holes in no definite arrangement, while at one point there lay a very long ladder carelessly flung down. To this ladder, singularly enough, appeared to climb a particularly large amount of the frightful odor which encompassed everything. As he walked slowly about, it suddenly occurred to Willet that both the noise and the odor seemed strongest directly above the oddly pierced slabs, as if they might be crude trap-doors leading down to some still deeper region of horror. Kneeling by one, he worked at it with his hands, and found that with extreme difficulty he could budge it. At his touch, the moaning beneath ascended to a louder key, and only with vast trepidation did he persevere in the lifting of the heavy stone. A stench unnameable now rose up from below, and the doctor's head reeled dizzily as he laid back at the slab and turned his torch upon the exposed square of gaping blackness. If he had expected a flight of steps to some wide gulf of ultimate abomination, Willet was destined to be disappointed. For amidst that fodor and cracked whining he discerned only the brick-faced top of a cylindrical well, perhaps 1.5 yards in diameter, and devoid of any ladder or other means of descent. As the light shone down, the wailing changed suddenly to a series of horrible yelps, in conjunction with which there came again that sound of blind, futile scrambling and slippery thumping. The explorer trembled, unwilling even to imagine what noxious thing might be lurking in that abyss, but in a moment mustered up the courage to peer over the rough-hewn brick, lying at full length and holding the torch downward at arm's length to see what might lie below. For a second he could distinguish nothing but the slimy, moss-grown brick walls, sinking illimitably into that half-tangible miasma of murk and foulness and anguished frenzy. And then he saw that something dark was leaping clumsily and frantically up and down at the bottom of the narrow shaft, which must have been from 20 to 25 feet below the stone floor where he lay. The torch shook in his hand, but he looked again to see what manner of living creature might be immured there in the darkness of that unnatural well, left starving by young Ward through all the long months since the doctors had taken him away, and clearly only one of a vast number prisoned in the kindred wells, whose pierced stone covers so thickly studded in the floor of the great vaulted cavern. Whatever the things were, they could not lie down in their cramped spaces, but must have crouched and whined and waited and feebly leaped all those hideous weeks since their master had abandoned them unheeded. But Marinus Bicknell Willet was sorry that he looked again, for surgeon and veteran of the dissecting room though he was, he has not been the same since. It is hard to explain just how a single sight of a tangible object with measurable dimensions could so shake and change a man, and we may only say that there is about certain outlines in entities a power of symbolism and suggestion which acts frightfully on a sensitive thinker's perspective and whispers terrible hints of obscure cosmic relations and unnameable realities beyond the protective illusions of common vision. In that second look, Willet saw such an outline or entity, for during the next few instants he was undoubtedly as stark mad as any inmate of Dr. Waite's private hospital. He dropped the electric torch from a hand drained of muscular power or nervous coordination, nor heeded the sound of crunching teeth which told of its fate at the bottom of the pit. He screamed and screamed and screamed, in a voice whose falsetto panic no acquaintance of his would ever have recognized. And though he could not rise to his feet, he crawled and rolled desperately away over the damp pavement where dozens of Tartarian wells poured forth their exhausted whining and yelping to answer his own insane cries. He tore his hands on the rough loose stones, and many times bruised his head against the frequent pillars, but still he kept on. Then at last he slowly came to himself in the utter blackness and stench, and stopped his ears against the droning wail into which the burst of yelping had subsided. He was drenched with perspiration, and without means of producing a light, stricken and unnerved in the abysmal blackness and horror, and crushed with a memory he could never efface. Beneath him dozens of those things still lived, and from one of the shafts the cover was removed. He knew that what he had seen could never climb up the slippery walls, yet shuddered at the thought that some obscure foothold might exist. What the thing was, he never could tell. It was like some of the carvings on the hellish altar, but it was alive. Nature had never made it in this form, for it was too palpably unfinished. The deficiencies were of the most surprising sort, and the abnormalities of proportion could not be described. Willett consents only to say that this type of thing must have represented entities which Ward called up from imperfect salts, and which he kept for servile or ritualistic purposes. If it had not had a certain significance, its image would not have been carved on that damnable stone. It was not the worst thing depicted on that stone, but Willett never opened the other pits. At the time, the first connected idea in his mind was an idle paragraph from some of the old Kerwin data he had digested long before. A phrase used by Simon or Jebediah Orne in that portentous confiscated letter to the bygone sorcerer. Certainly, there was nothing but the liveliest awfulness in that which H raised up from what he could gather only a part of. Then, horribly supplementing rather than displacing this image, there came a recollection of those ancient lingering rumors, aren't the burned, twisted thing found in the field a week after the Kerwin raid. Charles Ward had once told the doctor what old Slocum said of that object, that it was neither thoroughly human nor wholly allied to any animal which Pawtuxet folk had ever seen or read about. These words hummed in the doctor's mind as he rocked to and fro, squatting on the nitrous stone floor. He tried to drive them out, and repeated the Lord's Prayer to himself, eventually trailing off into a mnemonic hodgepodge like the modernistic wasteland of Mr. T.S. Eliot, and finally reverting to the oft-repeated dual formula he had lately found in Ward's underground library. Ye, Ningna, Yogg-Sothoth, and so on till the final underlined Zero. It seemed to soothe him, and he staggered to his feet after a time, lamenting bitterly his fright-lost torch, and looking wildly about for any gleam of light in the clutching inkiness of the chilly air. Think he would not, but he strained his eyes in every direction for some faint glint or reflection of the bright illumination he had left in the library. After a while he thought he detected a suspicion of a glow indefinitely far away, and toward this he crawled in agonized caution on hands and knees, amidst the stench and howling, always feeling ahead lest he collide with the numerous great pillars, or stumble into the abominable pit he had uncovered. Once his shaking fingers touched something, which he knew must be the steps leading to the hellish altar, and from this spot he recoiled in loathing. At another time he encountered the pierced slab he had removed, and here his caution became almost pitiful. But he did not come upon the dread aperture after all, nor did anything issue from that aperture to detain him. What had been down there made no sound nor stir. Evidently its crunching of the fallen electric torch had not been good for it. Each time Willett's fingers felt a perforated slab he trembled. His passage over it would sometimes increase the groaning below, but generally it would produce no effect at all, since he moved very noiselessly. Several times during his progress the glow ahead diminished perceptibly, and he realized that the various candles and lamps he had left must be expiring one by one. The thought of being lost in utter darkness, without matches, amidst this underground world of nightmare labyrinths impelled him to rise to his feet and run, which he could safely do now that he had passed the open pit, for he knew that once the light failed, his only hope of rescue and survival would lie in whatever relief party Mr. Ward might send after missing him for a sufficient period. Presently, however, he emerged from the open space into the narrower corridor, and definitely located the glow as coming from a door on his right. In a moment he had reached it, and was standing once more in young Ward's secret library, trembling with relief, and watching the sputterings of that last lamp which had brought him to safety. Part 4. In another moment he was hastily filled the burned-out lamps from an oil supply he had previously noticed, and when the room was bright again he looked around to see if he might find a lantern for further exploration. For racked though he was with horror, his sense of grim purpose was still utmost, and he was firmly determined to leave no stone unturned in his search for the hideous facts behind Charles Ward's bizarre madness. Failing to find a lantern, he chose the smallest of the lamps to carry, also filling his pockets with candles and matches, and taking with him a gallon can of oil, which he proposed to keep for preserve use in whatever hidden laboratory he might uncover beyond the terrible open space with its unclean altar and nameless covered wells. To traverse that space again would require his utmost fortitude, but he knew it must be done. Fortunately, neither the frightful altar nor the open shaft were near the vast cell-indented wall which bounded the cavern area, and whose black mysterious archways would form the next goals of a logical search. So Willett went back to that great pillared hall of stench and anguished howling, turning down his lamp to avoid any distant glimpse of the hellish altar, or of the uncovered pit with the pierced stone slab beside it. Most of the black doorways led merely to small chambers, some vacant and some evidently used as storerooms, and in several of the later he saw some very curious accumulations of various objects. One was packed with rotting and dust-draped bales of spare clothing, and the explorer thrilled when he saw that it was unmistakably the clothing of a century and a half before. In another room he found numerous odds and ends of modern clothing, as if gradual provisions were being made to equip a large body of men. But what he disliked most of all were the huge copper vats which occasionally appeared. These, and the sinister incrustations upon them. He liked them even less than the weirdly figured leaden bowls whose rims retained such obnoxious deposits, and round which clung repellent odors perceptible above even the general noisomeness of the crypt. When he had completed about half the entire circuit of the wall, he found another corridor like that from which he had come, and out of which many doors opened. This he proceeded to investigate, and after entering 3 rooms of medium size and of no significant contents, he came at last to a large oblong apartment, whose business-like tanks and tables, furnaces and modern instruments, occasional books and endless shelves of jars and bottles proclaimed it indeed the long-sought laboratory of Charles Ward, and no doubt of old Joseph Curwen before him. After lighting the 3 lamps which he found filled and ready, Dr. Willett examined the place and all its appurtenances with the keenest interest, noting from the relative quantities of various reagents on the shelves that young Ward's dominant concern must have been with some branch of organic chemistry. On the whole, little could be learned from the scientific ensemble, which included a gruesome-looking dissecting table, so that the room was really rather a disappointment. Among the books was a tattered old copy of Borellus in black letter, and it was weirdly interesting to note that Ward had underlined the same passage whose marking had so perturbed good Mr. Merritt at Curwen's farmhouse more than a century and a half before. That older copy, of course, must have perished along with the rest of Curwen's occult library in the final raid. 3 archways opened off the laboratory, and these the doctor proceeded to sample in turn. From his cursory survey, he saw that 2 led merely to small storerooms. But these he canvassed with care, remarking the piles of coffins in various stages of damage, and shuddering violently at 2 or 3 of the few coffin plates he could decipher. There was much clothing also stored in these rooms, and several new and tightly nailed boxes which he did not stop to investigate. Most interesting of all, perhaps, were some odd bits which he judged to be fragments of old Joseph Curwen's laboratory appliances. These had suffered damage at the hands of the raiders, but were still partly recognizable as the chemical paraphernalia of the Georgian period. The third archway led to a very sizable chamber, entirely lined with shelves, and having in the center a table bearing 2 lamps. These lamps were lighted, and in their brilliant glow studied the endless shelving which surrounded him. Some of the upper levels were wholly vacant, but most of the space was filled with small, odd-looking leaden jars of 2 general types, one tall and without handles like a Grecian lachesis or oil jug, and the other with a singular handle and proportioned like a Phaleron jug. All had metal stoppers, and these were covered with peculiar-looking symbols molded in low relief. In a moment the doctor noticed that these jugs were classified with great rigidity, all the lachethoi being on one side of the room with a large wooden sign reading Custodes above them, and all the Phalerons on the other, correspondingly labeled with a sign reading Materia. Each of the jars or jugs, except some on the upper shelves that turned out to be vacant, bore a cardboard tag, with a number apparently referring to a catalogue, and Willett resolved to look for the latter presently. For the moment, however, he was more interested in the nature of the array as a whole, and experimentally opened several of the lachethoi and Phalerons at random, with a view to a rough generalization. The result was invariable. Both types of jar contained a small quantity of a single kind of substance, a fine dusty powder of very light weight, and of many shades of dull neutral color. Good night, Yost. Take care. I'm glad you were able to stop by. We will have to do it again sometime. Have a good night. Or day. Have a good sleep. Have a good sleep. To the colors which formed the only point of variation, there was no apparent method of disposal, and no distinction between what occurred in the lachethoi and what occurred in the Phalerons. A bluish-gray powder might be by the side of a pinkish-white one, and any one in a Phaleron might have its exact counterpart in a lachethus. The most individual feature about the powders was their non-adhesiveness. Willett would pour one into his hand, and upon returning it to its jug would find that no residue whatever remained on his palm. The meaning of the 2 signs puzzled him, and he wondered why this battery of chemicals was separated so radically from those in glass jars on the shelves of the laboratory proper. Custodes Materia. That was the Latin for guards and materials, respectively. And then there came a flash of memory as to where he had seen that word guards before in connection with his dreadful mystery. It was, of course, in the recent letter to Dr. Allen purporting to be from old Edward Hutchinson, and the phrase had read, "There was no need to keep the guards in shape and eating off their heads, and it made much to be found in case of trouble, as you too well know." What did this signify? But wait, was there not still another reference to guards in this matter, which he had failed wholly to recall when reading the Hutchinson letter? Back in the old non-secretive days, word had told him of the Eliezer Smith diary, recording the spying of Smith and Whedon on the Curwen farm, and in that dreadful chronicle there had been a mention of conversations overheard before the old wizard betook himself wholly beneath the earth. There had been, Smith and Whedon insisted, terrible colloquies wherein figured Curwen, certain captives of his, and the guards of those captives. Those guards, according to Hutchinson or his avatar, had eaten their heads off, so that now Dr. Allen did not keep them in shape. And if not in shape, how save as the salts to which it appears this wizard band was engaged in reducing as many human bodies or skeletons as they could. So that was what the Lakithoi contained, the monstrous fruit of unhallowed rites and deeds, presumably won or cowed to such submission as to help, when called up by some hellish incantation, in the defense of their blasphemous master or the questioning of those who were not so willing. Willett shuddered at the thought of what he must have been pouring in and out of his hands, and for a moment felt an impulse to flee in panic from that cavern of hideous shelves, with their silent and perhaps watching sentinels. Then he thought of the materia, and the myriad Phaleron jugs on the other side of the room. Salts, too. And if not the salts of guards, then the salts of what? God, could it be possible that here lay the mortal relics of half the Titan thinkers of all the ages, snatched by supreme ghouls from crypts where the world thought them safe, and subject to the beck and call of madmen who sought to drain their knowledge for some still wilder end whose ultimate effect would concern, as poor Charles had hinted in his frantic note, all civilization, all natural law, perhaps even the fate of the solar system and the universe? And Marinus Bicknell Willett had sifted their dust through his hands. Then he noticed a small door at the farther end of the room, and calmed himself enough to approach it and examine the crude sign chiseled above. It was only a symbol, but it filled him with a vague spiritual dread, for a morbid dreaming friend of his had once drawn it on paper and told him a few of the things it means in the dark abyss of sleep. It was the sign of Koth, that dreamers see fixed above the archway of a certain black tower standing alone in twilight. And Willett did not like what his friend Randolph Carter had said of its powers. But a moment later he forgot the sign as he recognized a new acrid odor in the stench-filled air. This was a chemical rather than animal smell, and came clearly from the room beyond the door. And it was unmistakably the same odor which had saturated Charles Ward's clothing on the day the doctors had taken him away. So it was here that the youth had been interrupted by the final summons. He was wiser than old Joseph Curwen, for he had not resisted. Willett, boldly determined to penetrate every wonder and nightmare this nether realm might contain, seized the small lamp and crossed the threshold. A wave of nameless fright rolled out to meet him, but he yielded to no whim and deferred to no intuition. There was nothing alive here to harm him, and he would not be stayed in his piercing of the eldritch cloud which engulfed his patient. The room beyond the door was of medium size and had no furniture save a table, a single chair, and two groups of curious machines with clamps and wheels, which Willett recognized after a moment as medieval instruments of torture. On one side of the door stood a rack of savage whips, above which were some shelves bearing empty rows of shadowy pedestaled cups of lead, shaped like Grecian kylikes. On the other side was the table, with a powerful argand lamp, a pad and pencil, and two of the stoppered lacothi from the shelves outside set down at irregular places, as if temporarily or in haste. Willett lighted the lamp and looked carefully at the pad to see what notes young Ward might have been jotting down when interrupted, but found nothing more intelligible than the following disjointed fragments in that crabbed Curwen chirography, which shed no light on the case as a whole. "We did not escaped into walls and found place below. Sauld we say ye Sabbath and learnt ye way. Raised Yog Saloth thrice, and was ye next day delivered. F sought to wipe out all, knowing how to raise those from outside." As the strong argand blaze lit up the entire chamber, the doctor saw that the wall opposite the door, between the two groups of torturing appliances in the corners, was covered with pegs from which hung a set of shapeless-looking robes of a rather dismal yellowish white. But far more interesting were the two vacant walls, both of which were thickly covered with mystic symbols and formulae roughly chiseled in the smooth dressed stone. The damp floor also bore marks of carving, and with but little difficulty Willett deciphered a huge pentagram in the center, with a plain circle about 3 feet wide halfway between this and each corner. In one of these 4 circles, near where a yellowish rope had been flung carelessly down, there stood a shallow kylix of the sort found on the shelves above the whip-rack, and just outside the periphery of one of the Faleron jugs from the shelves in the other room, its tag numbered 118. This was unstoppered, and proved upon inspection to be empty, but the explorer saw with a shiver that the kylix was not. Within its shallow area, and saved from scattering only by the absence of wind in the sequestered cavern, lay a small amount of dry, dull greenish effervescent powder, which must have belonged in the jug, and Willett almost reeled at the implications that came sweeping over him as he correlated little by little the several elements and antecedents of the scene. The whips and the instruments of torture, the dust or salt from the jug of materia, the 2 lacothi from the custody's shelf, the robes, the formulae on the walls, the notes on the pad, the hints from letters and legends, and the 1,000 glimpses, doubts, and suppositions which had come to torment the friends and parents of Charles Ward. All these engulfed the doctor in a tidal wave of horror as he looked at that dry greenish powder outspread in the pedestal leaden kylix on the floor. With an effort, however, Willett pulled himself together and began studying the formula chiseled on the walls. From the stained and encrusted letters, it was obvious they were carved in Joseph Curwen's time, and their text was such as to be vaguely familiar to one who had read much Curwen material or delved extensively into the history of magic. One the doctor clearly recognized as what Mrs. Ward heard her son chanting on that ominous Good Friday a year before, and what an authority had told him it was a very terrible invocation addressed to secret gods outside the normal spheres. It was not spelled here exactly as Mrs. Ward had set it down from memory, nor yet as the authority had shown it to him in the forbidden pages of Eliphas Levi, but its identity was unmistakable, and such words as Sabbath, Metatron, Almusin, and Zariatnatmik sent a shudder of fright through the searcher who had seen and felt so much of cosmic abomination just around the corner. This was on the left-hand wall as one entered the room. The right-hand wall was no less thickly inscribed, and Willett felt a start of recognition as he came upon the pair of formulae so frequently occurring in the recent notes in the library. They were, roughly speaking, the same, with the ancient symbols of dragon's head and dragon's tail heading them as in Ward's scribblings. But the spelling differed quite widely from that of the modern versions, as if old Curwen had had a different way of recording sound, or as if later study had evolved more powerful and perfected variants of the invocations in question. The doctor tried to reconcile the chiseled version with the one which still ran persistently in his head, and found it hard to do so. Where the script he had memorized began, Ye Ning Nang Yog Sagoth, this epigraph started out as A Engenga Yogi Sathotha, which to his mind would seriously interfere with the syllabication of the second word. Ground as the latter text was into his consciousness, the discrepancy disturbed him, and he found himself chanting the first of the formula aloud in an effort to square the sound he conceived with the letters he found carved. Weird and menacing in that abyss of antique blasphemy rang his voice, its accents keyed to a droning sing-song, either through the spell of the past and the unknown, or through the hellish example of that dull, godless wail from the pits, whose inhuman cadences rose and fell rhythmically in the distance through the stench and the darkness. Ye Ningna Yog Sithoth, He Legeb, Fe Thredog, Ua. But what was this cold wind which had sprung into life at the very outset of the chant? The lamps were sputtering woefully, and the gloom grew so dense that the letters on the wall nearly faded from sight. There was smoke, too, and an acrid odor which quite drowned out the stench from the faraway wells. An odor which he had smelt before, yet infinitely stronger and more pungent. He turned from the inscriptions to face the room with its bizarre contents, and saw that the kylix on the floor, in which the ominous effervescent powder had lain, was giving forth a cloud of thick greenish-black vapor of surprising volume and opacity. That powder! Great God, it had come from the shelf of materia. What was it doing now, and what had started it? The formula he had been chanting, the first of the pair. Dragon's head, ascending node. Blessed Savior, could it be? The doctor reeled, and through his head raced widely disjointed scraps from all he had seen, heard, and read of the frightful case of Joseph Curwen and Charles Dexter Ward. I say to you again, do not call up any that you cannot put down. Have you words for laying at all times ready, and stop not to be sure when there is any doubt of whom you have. 3 talks with what was therein inhumed. Mercy of heaven, what is that shape behind the parting smoke? I am going to take a quick break here before continuing on to part 5, because I am out of water and I need my hydration. And y'all need to take a break too. Get up, run around, grab some snacks. Won't be a long break. Maybe, I don't know, 5 or so minutes. Long enough for everybody to take a pee break. Get some water. So, I will be back shortly. And hey, I will run an ad and we can make another penny. Which I think is hilarious. So, we will be back shortly. Alright, I am back with Liquid to continue with the reading. This is the story that never ends. Part 5. Marinus Bicknell Willett has no hope that any part of his tale will be believed, except by certain sympathetic friends. Hence he has made no attempt to tell it beyond his most intimate circle. Only a few outsiders have ever heard it repeated, and of these the majority laugh and remark that the doctor surely is getting old. He has been advised to take a long vacation and to shun future cases dealing with mental disturbance. But Mr. Ward knows that the veteran physician speaks only a horrible truth. Did not he himself see the noisome aperture in the bungalow cellar? Did not Willett send him home overcome and ill at 11 o'clock that portentous morning? Did he not telephone the doctor in vain that evening, and again the next day? And had he not driven to the bungalow itself on that following noon, finding his friend unconscious but unharmed on one of the beds upstairs? Willett had been breathing stertorously and opened his eyes slowly when Mr. Ward gave him some brandy fetched from the car. Then he shuddered and screamed, crying out, "That beard, those eyes, God, who are you?" A very strange thing to say to a trim, blue-eyed, clean-shaven gentleman whom he had known from the latter's boyhood. In the bright noon sunlight, the bungalow was unchanged since the previous morning. Willett's clothing bore no disarrangement beyond certain smudges and worn places at the knees, and only a faint, acrid odor reminded Mr. Ward of what he had smelt on his son that day he was taken to the hospital. The doctor's flashlight was missing, but his valise was safely there, as empty as when he had brought it. Before indulging in any explanations, and obviously with great moral effort, Willett staggered dizzily down to the cellar and tried the fateful platform before the tubs. It was unyielding. Crossing to where he had left his yet unused tool satchel the day before, he obtained a chisel and began to pry at the stubborn planks one by one. Underneath, the smooth concrete was still visible, but of any opening or perforation there was no longer a trace. Nothing yawned at this time to sicken the mystified father who had followed the doctor downstairs. Only the smooth concrete underneath, the planks, no noisome well, no world of subterranean horrors, no secret library, no Kerwin papers, no nightmare pits of stench and howling, no laboratory or shelves or chiseled formulae. No. Dr. Willett turned pale and clutched at the younger man. "Yesterday," he asked softly, "did you see it here? And smell it?" And when Mr. Ward, himself transfixed with dread and wonder, found strength to nod an affirmative, the physician gave a sound half a sigh and half a gasp, and nodded in turn. "Then I will tell you," he said. So for an hour, in the sunniest room they could find upstairs, the physician whispered his frightful tale to the wondering father. There was nothing to relate beyond the looming up of that form when the greenish-black vapor from the kylix parted, and Willett was too tired to ask himself what had really occurred. There were futile, bewildered head-shakings from both men, and once Mr. Ward ventured a hushed suggestion. "Do you suppose it would be of any use to dig?" The doctor was silent, for it seemed hardly fitting for any human brain to answer when powers of unknown spheres had so vitally encroached on this side of the great abyss. Again Mr. Ward asked, "But where did it go? It brought you here, you know, and it sealed up the hole somehow." And Willett again let silence answer for him. But after all, this was not the final phase of the matter. Reaching for his handkerchief before rising to leave, Dr. Willett's fingers closed upon a piece of paper in his pocket, which had not been there before, and which was companioned by the candles and matches he had seized in the vanished vault. It was a common sheet, torn obviously from the cheap pad in that fabulous room of horror somewhere underground. And the writing, too, upon it was that of an ordinary lead pencil, doubtless the one which had lain beside the pad. It was folded very carelessly, and beyond the faint, acrid scent of the cryptic chamber bore no mark or print of any world but this. But in the text itself it did indeed reek with wonder, for there was no script of any wholesome age, but the labored strokes of medieval darkness, scarcely legible to the layman who now strained over it, yet having combinations of symbols which seemed vaguely familiar. The briefly scrawled message was this, and its mystery lent purpose to the shaken pair, who forthwith walked steadily out to the ward car and gave orders to be driven first to a quiet dining place and then to the John Hay Library on the hill. And then there's just some possibly text that doesn't form any words that I can make out. So, apparently it was some eldritch writing. At the library, it was easy to find good manuals of paleography, and over these the two men puzzled till the lights of evening shone out from the great chandelier. In the end they found what was needed. The letters were indeed no fantastic invention, but the normal script of a very dark period. They were the pointed Saxon minuscules of the 8th or 9th century A.D., and brought with them memories of an uncouth time when under a fresh Christian veneer ancient faiths and ancient rites stirred stealthily, and the pale moon of Britain looked sometimes on strange deeds in the Roman ruins of Caerleon and Hexham, and by the towers along Hadrian's crumbling wall. The words were in such Latin as a barbarous age might remember. Corvinus necandis est, cadaver aquae forti te solventum, nec aliquid retenendum, tassi un pols, which may roughly be translated: Curwen must be killed. The body must be dissolved in aqua fortis, nor must anything be retained. Keep silence as best you are able. Willett and Mr. Ward were mute and baffled. They had met the unknown, and found that they lacked emotions to respond to it, as if they vaguely believed they ought. With Willett especially, the capacity for receiving fresh impressions of awe was well nigh exhausted, and both men sat still and helpless till the closing of the library forced them to leave. Then they drove listlessly to the Ward mansion in Prospect Street, and talked to no purpose into the night. The doctor rested towards morning, but did not go home, and he was still there Sunday noon when a telephone message came from the detectives who had been assigned to look up Dr. Allen. Mr. Ward, who was pacing nervously about in a dressing gown, answered the call in person, and told the men to come up early the next day when he heard their report was almost ready. Both Willett and he were glad this phase of the matter was taking form, for whatever the origin of the strange minuscule message, it seemed certain that the Curwen who must be destroyed could be no other than the bearded and spectacled stranger. Charles had feared this man, and had said in the frantic note that he must be killed and dissolved in acid. Allen, moreover, had been receiving letters from the strange wizards in Europe under the name of Curwen, and palpably regarded himself as an avatar of the bygone necromancer. And now from a fresh and unknown source had come a message saying that Curwen must be killed and dissolved in acid. The linkage was too unmistakable to be facetious, and besides, was not Alan planning to murder young Ward upon the advice of the creature called Hutchinson? Of course, the letter they had seen had never reached the bearded stranger, but from its text they could see that Alan had already formed plans for dealing with the youth if he grew too squeamish. Without doubt, Alan must be apprehended, and even if the most drastic directions were not carried out, he must be placed where he could inflict no harm upon Charles Ward. That afternoon, hoping against hope to extract some gleam of information and the inmost mysteries from the only available one capable of giving it, the father and the doctor went down the bay and called on young Charles at the hospital. Simply and gravely Willett told him all he had found, and noticed how pale he turned as each description made certain the truth of the discovery. The physician employed as much dramatic effect as he could, and watched for a wincing on Charles' part when he approached the matter of the covered pits and the nameless hybrids within. But Ward did not wince. Willett paused, and his voice grew indignant as he spoke of how the things were starving. He taxed the youth with shocking inhumanity, and shivered when only a sardonic laugh came in reply. For Charles, having dropped as useless his pretense that the crypt did not exist, seemed to see some ghastly jest in this affair, and chuckled hoarsely at something which amused him. Then he whispered, in accents doubly terrible because of the cracked voice he used, "Damn 'em. They do eat, but they don't need to. That's the rare part. A month, you say, without food? Lewd, sir, you be modest. Do you know, that was the joke on poor old Whipple and his virtuous bluster. Kill everything off, would he? Why, damn, he was half deaf with the noise from outside, and never saw or heard aught from the wells. He never dreamed they were there at all. Devil take ye, those cursed things have been howling down there ever since Curwen was done for 157 years gone." But no more than this could Willett get from the youth. Horrified, yet almost convinced against his will, he went on with his tale in the hope that some incident might startle his auditor out of the mad composure he maintained. Looking at the youth's face, the doctor could not but feel a kind of terror at the changes which recent months had wrought. Truly, the boy had drawn down nameless horrors from the skies. When the room with the formulae and the greenish dust was mentioned, Charles showed his first sign of animation. A quizzical look overspread his face as he heard what Willett had read on the pad, and he ventured the mild statement that those notes were old ones, of no possible significance to anyone not deeply initiated in the history of magic. But, he added, had you but known the words to bring up that which I had out in the cup, you had not been here to tell me this. 'Twas number 118, and I conceive you would have shock had you looked it up in my list in the other room. 'Twas never raised by me, but I meant to have it up that day you came to invite me hither. Then Willett told of the formula he had spoken, and of the greenish-black smoke which had arisen, and as he did so he saw true fear dawn for the first time on Charles' Ward's face. "It came, and you be here alive?" As Ward croaked the words, his voice seemed almost to burst free of its trammels, and sink to cavernous abysses of uncanny resonance. Willett, gifted with a flash of inspiration, believed he saw the situation, and wove into his reply a caution from a letter he remembered. "Number 118, you say? But don't forget that stones are all changed now in 9 grounds out of 10. You are never sure till you question." And then, without warning, he drew forth the minuscule message and flashed it before the patient's eyes. He could have wished no stronger result, for Charles Ward fainted forthwith. All this conversation, of course, had been conducted with the greatest secrecy, lest the resident alienist accuse the father and the physician of encouraging a madman in his delusions. Unaided, too, Dr. Willett and Mr. Ward picked up the stricken youth and placed him on the couch. In reviving, the patient mumbled many times of some words which he must get to Orne and Hutchinson at once. So when his consciousness seemed fully back, the doctor told him that of those strange creatures at least one was his bitter enemy, and had given Dr. Allen advice for his assassination. This revelation produced no visible effect, and before it had made the visitors could see that their host had already the look of a hunted man. After that he would converse no more, so Willett and the father departed presently, leaving behind a caution against the bearded Allen, to which the youth only replied that this individual was very safely taken care of, and could do no one any harm even if he wished. This was said with an almost evil chuckle, very painful to hear. They did not worry about any communications Charles might indite to that monstrous pair in Europe, since they knew that the hospital authorities seized all outgoing mail for censorship, and would pass no wild or outre-looking missive. There is, however, a curious sequel to the matter of Orne and Hutchinson, if such indeed the exiled wizards were. Moved by such vague presentiment amidst the horrors of that period, Willett arranged with an international press-cutting bureau for accounts of notable current crimes and accidents in Prague and in eastern Transylvania, and after 6 months believed that he had found 2 very significant things amongst the multifarious items he received and had translated. One was the total wrecking of a house by night in the oldest quarter of Prague, and the disappearance of the evil old man called Joseph Nadek, who had dwelt in it alone ever since anyone could remember. The other was a Titan explosion in the Transylvania mountains east of Rakas, and the utter extirpation, with all its inmates, of the ill-regarded Castle Ferenczi, whose master was so badly spoken of by peasants and soldiers alike that he would have shortly have been summoned to Bucharest for serious questioning had not this incident cut off a career already so long as to antedate all common memory. Willett maintains that the hand which wrote these minuscules was able to wield stronger weapons as well, and that while Curwen was left to him to dispose of, the writer felt able to find and deal with Orne and Hutchinson itself. Of what their fate may have been, the doctor strives steadily not to think. Part 6. The following morning, Dr. Willett hastened to the Ward home to be present when the detectives arrived. Allen's destruction or imprisonment, or Curwen's, if one might regard the tacit claim to reincarnation as valid, he felt must be accomplished at any cost, and he communicated this conviction to Mr. Ward as they sat waiting for the men to come. They were downstairs this time, for the upper parts of the house were beginning to be shunned because of the peculiar nauseousness which hung indefinitely about, a nauseousness which the older servants connected with some curse left by the vanished Corwin portrait. At 9 o'clock, the 3 detectives presented themselves and immediately delivered all they had had to say. They had not, regrettably enough, located the brava Tony Gomes, as they had wished, nor had they found the least trace of Dr. Allen's source or present whereabouts, but they had managed to unearth a considerable number of local impressions and facts concerning the reticent stranger. Allen had struck Pawtuxet people as a vaguely unnatural being, and there was an universal belief that his thick Van Dyke beard was either dyed or false, a belief inclusively upheld by the finding of such a false beard, together with a pair of dark glasses, in his room at the fateful bungalow. His voice, Mr. Ward could well testify from his one telephone conversation, had a depth and hollowness that could not be forgotten, and his glance seemed malign even through his smoked and horn-rimmed glasses. One shopkeeper, in the course of negotiations, had seen a specimen of his handwriting and declared it was very queer and crabbed, this being confirmed by penciled notes of no clear meaning found in his room and identified by the merchant. In connection with the vampirism rumors of the preceding summer, a majority of the gossips believed that Allen, rather than Ward, was the actual vampire. Statements were also obtained from the officials who had visited the bungalow after the unpleasant incident of the motor truck robbery. They had felt less of the sinister in Dr. Allen, but had recognized him as the dominant figure in the queer, shadowy cottage. The place had been too dark for them to observe him clearly, but they would know him again if they saw him. His beard had looked odd, and they thought he had some slight scar above his dark spectacled red eye. As for the detective's search of Allen's room, it yielded nothing definite save the beard and glasses, and several penciled notes in a crabbed writing which Willett at once saw was identical with that shared by the old Kerwin manuscripts and by the voluminous recent notes of young Ward found in the vanished catacombs of horror. Dr. Willett and Mr. Ward got something of a profound, subtle, and insidious cosmic fear from this data as it was gradually unfolded, and almost trembled to follow up the vague, mad thought which had simultaneously reached their minds. The false beard and glasses, the crabbed Kerwin penmanship, the old portrait and its tiny scar, and the altered youth in the hospital with such a scar. That deep, hollow voice on the telephone. Was it not of this that Mr. Ward was reminded when his son barked forth those pitiable tones to which he now claimed to be reduced? Who had ever seen Charles and Allen together? Yes, the officials had once, but who later on? Was it not when Allen left that Charles suddenly lost his growing fright and became to live wholly at the bungalow? Kerwin, Allen, Ward, in that blasphemous and abominable fusion had two ages and two persons become involved. That damnable resemblance to the picture to Charles. Had it not used to stare and follow the boy around the room with its eyes? Why, too, did both Allen and Charles copy Joseph Kerwin's handwriting, even when alone and off guard? And then the frightful work of those people, the lost crypt of horrors that had aged the doctor overnight, the starved monsters in the noisome pits, the awful formula which had yielded such nameless results, the message in minuscules found in Willett's pocket, the papers and the letters and all the talk of graves and salts and discoveries. Whither did everything lead? In the end, Mr. Ward did the sensible thing. Steeling himself against any realization of why he did it, he gave the detectives an article to be shown to such Pawtuxet shopkeepers as had seen the portentous Dr. Allen. That article was a photograph of his luckless son, on which he now carefully drew in ink the pair of heavy glasses and the black pointed beard which the men had brought from Allen's room. For 2 hours he waited with the doctor in the oppressive house where fear and miasma were slowly gathering as the empty panel in the upstairs library leered and leered and leered. Then the men returned. Yes, the altered photograph was a very passable likeness of Dr. Allen. Mr. Ward turned pale, and Willett wiped a sudden dampened brow with his handkerchief. Allen, Ward, Kerwin. It was becoming too hideous for coherent thought. What had the boy called out of the void, and what had it done to him? What really had happened from first to last? Who was this Allen who sought to kill Charles as too squeamish? And why had his distant victim said in the postscript to that frantic letter that he must be so completely obliterated in acid? Why, too, had the minuscule message, of whose origin no one dared think, said that Kerwin must likewise be obliterated? What was the change, and when had the final stage occurred? That day when his frantic note was received, he had been nervous all the morning. Then there was an alteration. He had slipped out unseen and staggered boldly and past the men hired to guard him. That was the time when he was out. But no. Had he not cried out in terror as he entered his study? This very room? What had he found there? Or wait. What had found him? that simulacrum which brushed boldly in without having been seen to go? Was that an alien shadow and a horror forcing itself upon a trembling figure which had never gone out at all? Had not the butler spoken of queer noises? Willett rang for the man and asked him some low-toned questions. It had, surely enough, been a bad business. There had been cries, gasp, a choking, and a sort of clattering or creaking or thumping, or all of these. And Mr. Charles was not the same when he stalked out without a word. The butler shivered as he spoke, and sniffed at the heavy air that blew down from some open window upstairs. Terror had settled definitely upon the house, and only the businesslike detectives failed to imbibe a full measure of it. Even they were restless, for this case had held vague elements in the background which pleased them not at all. Dr. Willett was thinking deeply and rapidly, and his thoughts were terrible ones. Now and then he would almost break into mutterings as he ran over in his head a new, appalling, and increasingly conclusive chain of nightmare happenings. Then Dr. Ward made a sign that the conference was over, and everyone save him and the doctor left the room. It was noon now, but shadows as of coming night seemed to engulf the phantom-haunted mansion. Willett began talking very seriously to his host, and urged that he leave a great deal of the future investigation to him. There would be, he predicted, certain obnoxious elements which a friend could bear better than a relative. As family physician, he must have a free hand, and the first thing he required was a period alone and undisturbed in the abandoned library upstairs, where the ancient overmantel had gathered about itself an aura of noisome horror more intense than when Joseph Curwen's features themselves glanced slyly down from the painted panel. Mr. Ward, dazed by the flood of grotesque morbidities and unthinkable maddening suggestions that poured in upon him from every side, could only acquiesce. And half an hour later the doctor was locked in the shunned room with the paneling from Olney Court. The father, listening outside, heard fumbling sounds of moving and rummaging as the moments passed, and finally a wrench and a creak, as if a tight cupboard door were being opened. Then there was a muffled cry, a kind of snorting choke, and a hasty slamming of whatever had been opened. Almost at once the key rattled, and Willett appeared in the hall, haggard and ghastly, and demanding wood for the real fireplace on the south wall of the room. The furnace was not enough, he said, and the electric log had little practical use. Longing, yet not daring to ask questions, Mr. Ward gave the requisite orders, and a man brought some stout pine logs, shuddering as he entered the tainted air of the library to place them in the grate. Willett, meanwhile, had gone up to the dismantled laboratory and brought down a few odds and ends not included in the moving of the July before. They were in a covered basket, and Mr. Ward never saw what they were. Then the doctor locked himself in the library once more, and by the clouds of smoke which rolled down past the windows from the chimney, it was known that he had lighted the fire. Later, after a great rustling of newspapers, that odd wrench and creaking were heard again, followed by a thumping which none of the eavesdroppers liked. Thereafter 2 suppressed cries of Willett's were heard, and hard upon these came a swishing rustle of indefinable hatefulness. Finally, the smoke that the wind beat down from the chimney grew very dark and acrid, and everyone wished that the weather had spared them this choking and venomous inundation of peculiar fumes. Mr. Ward's head reeled, and the servants all clustered together in a knot to watch the horrible black smoke whoop down. After an age of waiting, the vapors seemed to lighten, and half-formless sounds of scraping, sweeping, and other minor operations were heard behind the bolted door. And at last, after the slamming of some cupboard within, Willett made his appearance, sad, pale, and haggard, and bearing the cloth-draped basket he had taken from the upstairs laboratory. He had left the window open, and into that once accursed room was pouring a wealth of pure, wholesome air to mix with malignity now, and rose as calm and stately in its white paneling, as if it had never borne the picture of Joseph Curwen. Night was coming on, yet this time its shadows held no latent fright, but only a gentle melancholy. Of what he had done the doctor would never speak. To Mr. Ward he said, "I can answer no questions, but I will say that there are different kinds of magic. I have made a great purgation, and those in this house will sleep the better for it." Part 7. That Dr. Willett's purgation had been an ordeal almost as nerve-wracking in its way as his hideous wanderings in the vanished crypt is shown by the fact that the elderly physician gave out completely as soon as he reached home that evening. For 3 days he rested constantly in his room, though servants later muttered something about having heard him after midnight on Wednesday, when the outer door softly opened and closed with phenomenal softness. Servants' imaginations, fortunately, are limited, else comment might have been excited by an item in Thursday's evening bulletin, which ran as follows: North End ghouls active again. After a lull of 10 months since the dastardly vandalism in the Weeding lot at the North Burial Ground, a nocturnal prowler was glimpsed early this morning in the same cemetery by Robert Hart, the night watchman. Happening to glance for a moment from his shelter at about 2 a.m., Hart observed the glow of a lantern or pocket torch not far to the northwest, and upon opening the door detected the figure of a man with a trowel very plainly silhouetted against a nearby electric light. At once starting in pursuit, he saw the figure dart hurriedly towards the main entrance, gaining the street and losing himself among the shadows before approaching or capture was possible. Like the first of the ghouls active during the past year, this intruder had done no real damage before detection. A vacant part of the Ward lot showed signs of a little superficial digging, but nothing even nearly the size of a grave had been attempted, and no previous grave had been disturbed. Hart, who could not describe the prowler except as a small man, probably having a full beard, inclines to the view that all 3 of the digging incidents have a common source, but police from the second station think otherwise on account of the savage nature of the second incident, where an ancient coffin was removed and its headstone violently shattered. The first of the incidents, in which it is thought an attempt to bury something was frustrated, occurred a year ago last March, and has been attributed to bootleggers seeking a cache. It is possible, said Sergeant Riley, that this third affair is of a similar nature. Officers at the second station are taking special pains to capture the gang of miscreants responsible for these repeated outrages. All day Thursday, Dr. Willett rested as if recuperating from something past or nerving himself for something to come. In the evening he wrote a note to Mr. Ward, which was delivered the next morning, and which caused the half-day's parent to ponder long and deeply. Mr. Ward had not been able to go down to business since the shock of Monday, with its baffling reports and its sinister purgation. But he found something calming about the doctor's letter in spite of the despair it seemed to promise and the fresh mysteries it seemed to evoke. 10 Barnes Street, Providence, Rhode Island, April 12th, 1928. Dear Theodore, I feel that I must say a word to you before doing what I am going to do tomorrow. It will conclude the terrible business we have been going through, for I feel that no spade is ever likely to reach that monstrous place we know of. But I am afraid it won't set your mind at rest unless I expressly assure you how very conclusive it is. You have known me ever since you were a small boy, so I think you will not distress me when I hint that some matters are best left undecided and unexplored. It is better that you attempt no further speculation as to Charles' case, and almost imperative that you tell his mother nothing more than she already suspects. When I call on you tomorrow, Charles will have escaped. That is all which need remain in anyone's mind. He was mad, and he escaped. You can tell his mother gently and gradually about the mad part when you stop sending the typed notes in his name. I'd advise you to join her in Atlantic City and take a rest for yourself. God knows you need one after this shock, as I do myself. I'm going south for a while to calm down and brace up. So don't ask me any questions when I call. It may be that something will go wrong, but I'll tell you if it does. I don't think it will. There will be nothing more to worry about, for Charles will be very, very safe. He is now, safer than you dream. You need hold no fears about Alan, or who or what he is. He forms as much a part of the past as Joseph Curwen's picture, and when I ring your doorbell you may feel certain that there is no such person, and what wrote that minuscule message will never trouble you or yours. But you must steel yourself to melancholy and prepare your wife to do the same. I must tell you frankly that Charles' escape will not mean his restoration to you. He has been afflicted with a peculiar disease, as you must realize from the subtle physical as well as mental changes in him, and you must not hope to see him again. Have only this consolation, that he was never a fiend, or even truly a madman, but only an eager, studious, and curious boy whose love of mystery and of the past was his undoing. He stumbled on things no mortal ought ever to know, and reached back through the years as no one ever should reach, and something came out of those years to engulf him. And now comes the matter in which I must ask you to trust me most of all, for there will be indeed no uncertainty about Charles' fate. In about a year, say, you can, if you wish, devise a suitable account of the end, for the boy will be no more. You can pull up a stone in your lot at the North Burial Ground exactly 10 feet west of your father's and facing the same way, and that will mark the true resting place of your son. Nor need you fear that it will mark any abnormality or changeling. The ashes in that grave will be those of your own unaltered bone and sinew, of the real Charles Dexter Ward, whose mind you watched from infancy. The real Charles, with the olive mark on his hip, and without the black witch mark on his chest or the pit on his forehead. The Charles who never did actual evil, and who will have paid with his life for his squeamishness. That is all. Charles will have escaped, and a year from now you can put up his stone. Do not question me tomorrow, and believe that the honor of your ancient family remains untainted now, as it has been at all times in the past. With profoundest sympathy and exhortations to fortitude, calmness, and resignation, I am ever sincerely your friend, Marinus B. Willett. So on the morning of April 13th, 1928, Marinus Bicknell Willett visited the room of Charles Dexter Ward at Dr. Waite's private hospital on Connecticut Island. The youth, though making no attempt to evade his caller, was in a sullen mood, and seemed disinclined to open the conversation which Willett obviously desired. The doctor's discovery of the crypt and his monstrous experience therein had of course created a new source of embarrassment, so that both hesitated perceptibly after the interchange of a few strained formalities. Then a new element of constraint crept in, as Ward seemed to read behind the doctor's mask-like face a terrible purpose which had never been there before. The patient quailed, conscious that since the last visit there had been a change whereby the solicitous family physician had given place to the ruthless and implacable avenger. Ward actually turned pale, and the doctor was the first to speak. "More," he said, "has been found out, and I must warn you fairly that reckoning is due." "Digging again, and coming upon more starved pets," was the ironic reply. It was evident that the youth meant to show bravado to the last. "No," Wilt slowly rejoined. "This time I did not have to dig. We have had men looking up Dr. Allen, and they found the false-bearded spectacles in the bungalow. "Excellent," commented the disquieted host in an effort to be wittily insulting. "And I trust they proved more becoming than the beard and glasses you now have on." "They would become you very well," came the even and studied response. As indeed they seemed to have done. As Willett said this, it almost seemed as though a cloud passed over the sun, though there was no change in the shadows on the floor. Then Ward ventured, "And is this what asks so hotly for a reckoning? Suppose a man does find it now and then useful to be twofold." "No," said Willett gravely. "Again you are wrong. It is no business of mine if any man seeks duality, provided he has any right to exist at all, and provided he does not destroy what called him out of space." Ward now started violently. "Well, sir, what have ye found, and what do you want with me?" The doctor let a little time elapse before replying, as if choosing his words for an effective answer. "I have found," he finally intoned, "something in a cupboard behind an ancient overmantel where a picture once was, and I have burned it and buried the ashes where the grave of Charles Dexter Ward ought to be." The madman choked and sprang from the chair in which he had been sitting. "Damn ye, who did you tell? And who'll believe it was he after these full 2 months, with me alive? What do you mean to do?" Willett, though a small man, actually took on a kind of judicial majesty as he calmed the patient with a gesture. "I have told no one. This is no common case. It is a madness out of time and a horror from beyond the spheres, which no police or lawyers or courts or alienists could ever fathom or grapple with. Thank God some chance has left inside me the spark of imagination, that I might not go astray in thinking out this thing. You cannot deceive me, Joseph Kerwin, for I know that your accursed magic is true. I know how you wove the spell that brooded outside the years and fastened on your double and descendant. I know how you drew him into the past and got him to raise you up from your detestable grave. I know how he kept you hidden in his laboratory, while you studied modern things and roved abroad as a vampire by night, and how you later showed yourself in beard and glasses that no one might wonder at your godless likeness to him. I know what you resolved to do when he balked at your monstrous rifling of the world's tombs, and at what you planned afterwards, and I know how you did it. You left off your beard and glasses and fooled the guards around the house. They thought it was he who went in, and they thought it was he who came out when you had strangled and hidden him. But you hadn't reckoned on the different contents of 2 minds. You were a fool, Kerwin, to fancy that a mere visual identity would be enough. Why didn't you think of the speech and the voice and the handwriting? It hasn't worked, you see, after all. You know better than I who or what wrote the messages in minuscules. But I will warn you it was not written in vain. There are abominations and blasphemies which must be stamped out, and I believe that the writers of those words will attend to Orne and Hutchinson. One of those creatures wrote you once, "Do not call up any that you cannot put down." You were undone once before, perhaps in that very way, and it may be that your own evil magic will undo you all again. Kerwin, a man can't tamper with nature beyond certain limits, and every horror you have woven will rise up to wipe you out. But here the doctor was cut short by a convulsive cry from the creature before him. Hopelessly at bay, weaponless, and knowing that any show of physical violence would bring a score of attendants to the doctor's rescue, Joseph Kerwin had recourse to his one ancient ally, and began a series of cabalistic motions with his forefinger, as his deep, horrible voice, now unconcealed by faint hoarseness, bellowed out the opening words of a terrible formula. Per Adonai Elohim, Adonai Jehovah, Adonai Sabaoth, Metraton. But Willett was too quick for him. Even as the dogs in the yard outside began to howl, and even as a chill wind sprang suddenly up from the bay, the doctor commenced a solemn and measured outcome show how well the lessons of the abyss had been learned. The doctor commenced the solemn and measured intonation of that which he had meant all along to recite. An eye for an eye, magic for magic, let the outcome show how well the lesson of the abyss had been learned. So in a clear voice, Marinette Bicknell Willett began the second of that pair of formulae, whose first had raised the writer of those minuscules, the cryptic invocation whose heading was the dragon's tail, sign of the descending node. Ogthrida Aif, Gebel Eth, Yog Sothoth, Hang Hang A, 0. At the very first word from Willett's mouth, the previously commenced formula of the patient stopped short. Unable to speak, the monster made wild motions with his arms until they too were arrested. When the awful name of Yog Sothoth was uttered, the hideous change began. It was not merely a dissolution, but rather a transformation or recapitulation, and Willett shut his eyes lest he faint before the rest of the incantation could be produced. But he did not faint, and that man of unholy centuries and forbidden secrets never troubled the world again. The madness out of time had subsided, and the case of Charles Dexter Ward was closed. Opening his eyes before staggering out of that room of horror, Dr. Willett saw that what he had kept in memory had not been kept amiss. There had, as he had predicted, been no need for acids, for like his accursed picture a year before, Joseph Curwen now lay scattered on the floor as a thin coating of fine bluish gray dust. And that, my lovelies, is finally the end of this story. We really need to rethink what we call a short story, because this was not one. But we have reached the end. We lived. And on that note, I think I am going to end the stream and go find someone that I can send whoever is still here and alive off to. You're gonna go to bed. Good night. Have a good sleep. Thanks for hanging out as long as you did. And let's see who we will go and raid, if anyone. Anna is online with Sand Experiment, so we will raid Anna. So, good night, everyone. Have a great night, and thanks for hanging out, and say hi to Anna.